Hello everyone.
Rise,
I am the
my
storyteller and I am
creature,
here to help you today.
from the silence
I know you use this video to
slumber.
fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Serpent,
Also, where are you
arise
from? And
from
what time are you
slumber
watching?
and heed
Now get
my
comfortable and
call.
relax. The sequoias stood like ancient sentinels in the pre-dawn darkness, their massive trunks disappearing into a canopy so thick it swallowed the stars. I'd driven north from San Francisco 3 days ago, seeking solitude among these giants near Eureka. But solitude felt different here, heavier, watching. The grove pressed in around my small camp with a silence that seemed too deliberate, too complete. My Honda Pilot looked absurdly small, parked beside the weathered picnic table, camping gear spilling from its open rear hatch. The Coleman lantern cast a warm circle of light that barely reached the nearest tree, beyond which everything dissolved into impenetrable black. I'd chosen this spot deliberately, Site 17, tucked away from the main loop where weekend warriors set up their RV cities. Here, the only neighbors were the trees and whatever lived among them. That changed when I heard the car door slam around midnight. Vehicle headlights swept across my camp as someone pulled into Site 18, maybe 30 yards through the trees. The engine died, leaving only the tick of cooling metal and hushed voices carrying on the still air.
I don't know,
I couldn't
but I'm
make
scared.
out words, just the cadence of conversation between two people setting up in the dark. Experienced campers by the sound of it. No fumbling with tent poles or cursing at stubborn zippers. They worked with the quiet efficiency of people who belonged in these places. Sleep came eventually, but restlessly. The sequoias creaked overhead with sounds like ship masts in a harbor, and every small noise jerked me alert. A branch falling somewhere in the distance. The rustle of something large moving through undergrowth. The forest had its own rhythm here, different from the pine woods I knew back east. Deeper, older. Morning brought fog that clung to the forest floor like smoke, transforming the familiar campground into something ethereal and strange. I could barely make out the shapes of my neighbors through the mist, a pop-up tent and a small SUV arranged with military precision. No signs of life yet, which wasn't unusual. Serious campers often rose before dawn or slept until the sun burned through the marine layer. I kept busy with camp routine, boiling water for coffee on my single burner, organizing gear that didn't need organizing. The fog began lifting around 8, revealing more of their setup. Professional-grade equipment, I noticed. The kind of tent that cost more than most people's monthly rent. A collapsible table arranged with what looked like electronic equipment under a dark tarp. That's when he appeared. The man emerged from the tree line carrying something that looked like a satellite dish, maybe 3 feet across, mounted on an adjustable tripod. Parabolic microphone, I realized. The kind wildlife documentarians use to record bird calls from impossible distances. He was older, maybe 60, with the lean build of someone who spent serious time outdoors. Graying beard, layers of technical clothing that whispered of expensive outdoor stores. He noticed me watching and raised a hand in greeting, working his way through the trees separating our camps. His approach was casual, friendly, but something about his movement struck me as overly deliberate, like he'd been planning this introduction. "Morning," he called out when he got close enough for conversation. "Hope we didn't disturb you last night. Tried to keep it quiet." "Not at all," I replied, though I realized I hadn't actually heard a second voice since those initial whispers. "Interesting equipment you've got there." He glanced back at the parabolic microphone, now set up and aimed vaguely into the forest canopy. "Research project. Trying to document owl communication patterns in old-growth forests. Amazing what you can pick up with the right gear. Conversations happening miles away." The way he emphasized conversations made something cold settle in my stomach, though I couldn't articulate why. We chatted for a few more minutes about the forest, camping, the unusual weather patterns this season, normal campground small talk. But I found myself studying his face, looking for something I couldn't name. His eyes kept drifting back toward my camp, taking inventory. He mentioned he'd be monitoring tonight after dark, when the spotted owls became active. Most of his recording happened between midnight and 4 a.m., when the forest came alive with sounds humans rarely heard. I nodded politely, made appropriate responses, but felt increasingly uncomfortable under his steady gaze. After he left, I tried to shake off the unease. Solo camping always made me paranoid the first night or two. Every sound amplified, every shadow suspicious. It was probably nothing more than that, combined with too much caffeine and the strange, muffled acoustics of this ancient grove. But I found myself glancing toward his camp throughout the day, noting when he moved around, when the equipment hummed to life, when he made small adjustments to that dish. From my position, I could see him occasionally wearing headphones, listening intently to whatever his microphone captured. Once, I could have sworn he turned the apparatus in my direction for several minutes before swiveling it back toward the trees. As afternoon faded to evening, the forest began its transformation. Sounds that had been absent all day started emerging. Distant bird calls, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, the creak and whisper of ancient wood responding to changing temperatures. I cooked a simple dinner over my camp stove, trying to focus on normal activities, but my attention kept drifting to the growing symphony around me. The parabolic microphone was active now, rotating slowly as my neighbor tracked different sounds. I could see him silhouetted against his lantern, headphones on, occasionally making notes in what looked like a field journal. Professional behavior for a wildlife researcher, but something about his posture suggested intense concentration on a very specific target. I retreated to my tent around 10, though sleep felt impossible. The forest was reaching peak activity. Owls calling from different directions, the flutter of bat wings overhead, and underneath it all, a low susurrus that might have been wind through the canopy or something else entirely. Through my tent wall, I could see the faint glow from my neighbor's camp and occasionally hear the soft whir of mechanical adjustment. Sometime after midnight, I became aware that the parabolic dish had stopped moving. No more mechanical sounds, no more rotating light patterns filtering through the trees. Just that steady glow from his lantern and the forest's natural soundscape. I lay still, listening, trying to determine what had changed. That's when I noticed the quality of silence around my own camp. Not complete silence. The owls were still calling, branches still creaked overhead, but a bubble of quiet that seemed to surround my tent specifically, like sound was being absorbed rather than reflected, pulled away into some hungry void. I must have dozed, because the next thing I knew, my own voice was talking to me. The sound crept into my awareness gradually, mixing with dream fragments until I couldn't tell if I was asleep or awake. Low conversational tone, definitely my voice, but saying words I'd never spoken. Something about moving closer to the fire, about staying quiet, about being careful not to wake someone. My eyes snapped open. The voice was coming from outside the tent, maybe 10 feet away, but there was no one there. Just my voice, speaking in hushed tones about things I didn't remember saying. The accent was right, the inflection perfectly matched, but the words felt foreign, like hearing someone else speak through my vocal cords. I lay frozen, afraid that moving would somehow make it worse, make the impossible voice aware of my listening. It continued for maybe 2 minutes, fragments of conversation that sounded like half of a phone call, responses to questions I couldn't hear. Then it stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving only the normal forest sounds and my hammering heartbeat. Sleep was impossible after that. I lay staring at the tent ceiling until dawn, every small sound magnified into potential threat. When gray light finally began filtering through the nylon, I dressed quickly and emerged to find my neighbor's camp empty. Tent still standing, equipment still in place, but no sign of the man himself. The parabolic microphone sat abandoned on its tripod, pointed directly at my tent. I approached cautiously, noting fresh tire tracks leading back toward the main road. On his camp table, partially hidden under the tarp, I found the source of my nighttime terror, a digital recording device connected to the microphone system. The display showed multiple files, each labeled with dates and times. The most recent entry was time-stamped 3:47 a.m. With trembling fingers, I pressed play. My own voice filled the air, crystal clear through the device's small speakers. But these weren't the fragments I'd heard during the night. This was a complete conversation, both sides audible, though I recognized only one voice as mine. The other speaker sounded like me too, but slightly different. Same pitch and accent, but with inflections I'd never use, word choices that felt foreign. The two versions of myself discussed moving camp, finding better shelter, staying hidden from something they never named. One voice, the one I recognized as truly mine, sounded tired, confused, asking questions the other answered with growing impatience. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes, covering topics I had no memory of discussing with anyone. More disturbing was the content. Both voices spoke as if they'd been traveling together for weeks, referencing shared experiences I'd never had, people I'd never met, places I'd never been. They discussed rationing supplies, avoiding main roads, and something about keeping the others from finding us. The familiar voice sounded increasingly distressed as the conversation progressed, while the strange but familiar one grew more commanding. I fast-forwarded through the file, finding similar conversations recorded over the past 3 nights. Hours of dialogue between two versions of myself, discussing an elaborate shared history I couldn't remember living. In the earliest recordings, both voices sounded similar, but as the nights progressed, they began diverging, one becoming more aggressive, more controlling, while the other grew passive and confused. The final recording was the most disturbing. Only one voice spoke, mine, but the commanding version I didn't recognize. It discussed plans for integration, talked about how he's almost ready to accept the transition, and ended with a whispered promise that, after tonight, there won't be any more confusion. The last words, barely audible through the speaker, made my blood freeze. "I can see you listening." I spun around, expecting to find someone watching from the trees, but the forest remained empty. My hands shook as I ejected the memory card from the recording device, pocketing it along with the device itself. Evidence, though, of what, I couldn't say. The walk to the ranger station felt endless, every shadow potentially hiding my doppelganger, every sound potentially his footsteps. When I finally reached the small building at the campground entrance, the duty ranger confirmed what I'd already suspected. My neighbor had paid for 4 additional nights but disappeared sometime before dawn. No forwarding information, no explanation, just an empty campsite and abandoned equipment. "Weird thing is," the ranger added, consulting his log, "the reservation was made in your name. Same first and last name anyway. Must be a coincidence." I drove south that afternoon, putting distance between myself and the sequoia grove, but I couldn't outrun the questions. The memory card sat in my passenger seat like a live grenade, containing conversations I couldn't remember having with a voice I couldn't explain. Every few miles I'd glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see my own face looking back from another car. The recordings haunted me for weeks. I played them obsessively, analyzing every word, searching for clues about their origin. Audio analysis software showed no signs of digital manipulation, no evidence of voice synthesis or mixing. According to every technical measure, these were genuine recordings of genuine conversations. But conversations with whom? And why couldn't I remember any of it? I began finding gaps in my memory, holes where hours or even entire days seemed missing. Phone records showed calls I didn't remember making to numbers I didn't recognize. Credit card statements revealed purchases at stores I'd never visited, in towns I'd never been to. Security cameras at a gas station in Oregon captured footage of me buying supplies at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, though I clearly remembered being asleep in my apartment that night. The most disturbing discovery came when I tried to research the campground online. According to official records, no one matching my neighbor's description had ever registered for Site 18. In fact, Site 18 had been closed for renovations since last spring, a detail the ranger claimed he'd mentioned during my check-in, though I had no memory of that conversation either. I drove back to the Sequoias twice, trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. Both times, I found Site 18 overgrown and clearly unused, with a weathered sign marking it as temporarily closed. The ground showed no evidence of recent camping, no tire tracks, no equipment impressions. Even my own campsite looked undisturbed, as if I'd never been there at all. The recordings remained the only proof that anything had happened, but even they began changing. Each time I listened, I noticed subtle differences, words that sounded slightly different, conversations that seemed to shift in tone or content. When I tried to share the files with others, they reported hearing only static, or what sounded like a single person talking to himself. Months later, I still carried the device everywhere, checking the files obsessively, searching for answers that seemed to retreat further with each listening. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that commanding version of my voice whispering just at the edge of perception, making plans I don't understand for a future I can't remember agreeing to. The most terrifying moment comes when I catch myself responding to those whispers, having conversations I don't remember starting, making promises in a voice that sounds like mine but speaks words I'd never choose. In those moments, I wonder if the integration he spoke of is already complete, if the person typing these words is the original or the replacement. The recorder sits beside me now as I write this, its red light blinking steadily, capturing every word. When I finish, there will be another file to analyze, another conversation to forget, another step toward a truth I'm no longer sure I want to discover. Because sometimes, in the quiet moments between waking and sleep, I remember fragments of those forest conversations. I remember agreeing to things, accepting changes, welcoming someone home to a mind that was always meant to be shared. And in those moments, I can't tell which voice is really mine. Story 2. The silence in Escalante's slot canyons isn't really silence at all. It's the sound of stone holding its breath. I'd learned this during my first solo expedition 3 years ago, but I'd forgotten how that particular quiet could press against your eardrums like water at depth. Now, standing at the mouth of an unnamed gorge 20 miles southeast of the main tourist routes, I felt that familiar compression settling into my skull. My father's voice shouldn't have been able to reach me here. "Hey, kiddo." The sound drifted down from the sandstone walls above, carried on air that tasted of ancient water and rust. My childhood nickname, spoken in his distinctive gravelly tone, the same voice that had called me from the front porch when dinner was ready, that had shouted my name across baseball diamonds and through shopping malls. But my father lived 1,600 miles away in Ohio, probably watching the evening news in his recliner, unaware that his son was standing in a crack in the earth where cell phones became expensive paperweights. I pulled out my GPS unit and checked the coordinates twice. The screen confirmed what I already knew. I was exactly where I'd planned to be, following a route I'd researched for months. The canyon ahead of me twisted into the rock like a question mark, its walls rising 90 feet on either side, narrowing to mere shoulder width in places. Perfect for photography, terrible for rational explanation of impossible voices. "Come on through, kiddo. Don't keep me waiting." The words seemed to originate from multiple points along the canyon walls simultaneously, as if the stone itself had learned speech. But there was something wrong with the vocal quality, a metallic undertone that reminded me of old cassette recordings played through cheap speakers. The kind of sound you get when someone learns to mimic human speech without understanding the organic warmth behind it. I adjusted my pack and started forward, my hiking boots crunching on the sandy floor. The canyon walls closed in gradually, their surfaces carved into flowing patterns by millennia of flash floods. Normally, I would have stopped every few yards to photograph the play of light and shadow, the way late afternoon sun painted watercolor stripes across the layered rock. Instead, I found myself moving faster, driven by a need to either find the source of my father's voice or prove to myself that heat and isolation were playing tricks with my mind. The emergency radio clipped to my belt had been a last-minute addition to my gear, something my ex-wife had insisted on after a hiker died of exposure in a similar canyon system the previous spring. I'd protested that I was experienced, that I knew the risks, but she'd threatened to call my father if I didn't take proper safety precautions. The irony wasn't lost on me now as I switched it on and cycled through the emergency beacon frequencies until I found the standardized rescue tone, a series of electronic beeps designed to cut through interference and atmospheric conditions. The sound bounced off the canyon walls in predictable patterns, creating the kind of echo effects that every child discovers when shouting into culverts or empty buildings. But as I continued deeper into the gorge, walking in the opposite direction from where I'd heard my father's voice, something began to go wrong with the echoes. The radio's beeps came back to me, but not quite right. They arrived a fraction of a second off rhythm, like a musician playing along to a song while wearing headphones with a delayed signal. The electronic pulses seemed to stumble over themselves, creating a jarring syncopation that made my teeth ache. It was the auditory equivalent of watching someone else's lips move while their words came out of your own mouth. I stopped walking and listened more carefully. The delayed beeps continued for several seconds after I'd turned off the radio, as if the canyon was attempting to complete a conversation it didn't understand. Like a parrot repeating phrases without comprehension, mimicking the pattern, but missing the meaning entirely. The walls here rose higher than I'd anticipated, creating a narrow corridor of shadow that turned the afternoon light into something geological, dense and amber and strange. I could see the sky as a ribbon of blue far above, but the sun had already moved past the canyon mouth, leaving me in a premature twilight that felt more like being inside something than simply below it. My breathing sounded unnaturally loud in the confined space, and I became hyper-aware of every footstep, every rustle of fabric against rock. The temperature had dropped noticeably as I'd moved deeper into the slot, but my skin felt feverish, hypersensitive to the movement of air that shouldn't have existed in such an enclosed space. "Almost there, kiddo. Just a little further." My father's voice again, but this time from behind me. I spun around, nearly losing my balance on the uneven floor, and stared back down the corridor I'd just traveled. The passage curved enough that I couldn't see all the way to the entrance, but I could see far enough to confirm that nothing human-sized could be hiding in the shadows. The metallic quality was more pronounced now, as if someone was speaking through a broken intercom system. But underneath that artificial timbre, the voice carried all the inflections and warmth I associated with my father. The slight Ohio accent, the way he drew out vowels when he was being patient with me, the particular cadence he used when he was proud of something I'd done. I forced myself to continue forward, though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. The canyon floor began to slope upward, and I could see that the walls were beginning to separate, opening toward what looked like a wider chamber ahead. My calves burned with the effort of climbing over tumbled boulders and navigating around deep pools of stagnant water that reflected the sky like dark mirrors. It took me 3 hours to work my way through the slot and find a route up to the rim. The climb itself was technical but manageable, a series of natural handholds and ledges that led up the outside of the formation. By the time I reached the top, the sun was setting, painting the entire landscape in shades of red and orange that made the world look like it was on fire. The view from the rim should have been spectacular. Miles of desert stretched in every direction, punctuated by isolated mesas and the distant purple outline of mountains. But I barely registered the scenery because of what I found in the dust near the edge of the cliff. Handprints, 4 of them, pressed into the fine sand that had accumulated in a depression between rocks. Adult-sized hands, but positioned in a place where no one could have reached without technical climbing equipment. The prints were fresh, so fresh that the wind hadn't yet begun to soften their edges, and they were positioned exactly where someone would have placed their hands if they were leaning over the edge to look down into the canyon I'd just climbed out of. I knelt beside the prints and held my own hand over them for comparison. The size was close enough to be disturbing. The fingers were slightly longer than mine, the palm a bit wider, but well within the range of normal variation. What made my skin crawl was their positioning. They weren't random handprints left by someone resting or climbing. They were deliberately placed, as if someone had been methodically pressing their palms into the dust to leave a message, or to leave proof of their presence. I looked around for any other sign of human activity. Footprints, disturbed vegetation, camping equipment, anything that might explain how someone had reached this position. The area around the handprints showed no other disturbance. No footprints led to or away from the edge. The surrounding rock showed no sign of rope abrasion or hardware placement. It was as if someone had simply materialized at the edge of the cliff, pressed their hands into the dust, and vanished. The radio on my belt crackled with static, though I was certain I'd turned it off. I checked the power switch twice before the sound stopped, leaving me in the vast silence of the desert evening. Stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and I realized I needed to start thinking about getting back to my vehicle before full darkness set in. But as I prepared to leave, Something made me turn back toward the canyon one more time. The urge was so strong it felt like a physical pull, as if invisible hands were turning my shoulders. I moved back to the edge and looked down into the slot where I'd spent the afternoon. The narrow passage lay in complete darkness now, a black line carved into the red rock. But as I watched, I began to see something that made no logical sense. Faint light seemed to be moving along the canyon floor, not the steady beam of a flashlight, but something that pulsed and flickered like candlelight seen through water. I pulled out my own flashlight and aimed it down into the canyon, but the beam couldn't penetrate far enough to reach the bottom. The pulsing light below continued its irregular pattern, moving slowly along the route I'd taken earlier in the day. It paused in the same places where I'd stopped to check my radio, lingered in the spots where I'd hesitated to listen for voices. It was following my exact path. The drive back to town took 40 minutes on dark desert roads, and I spent every one of them trying to rationalize what I'd experienced. Heat exhaustion could cause auditory hallucinations. Isolation and stress could trigger paranoid episodes. The handprints could have been left by rock climbers earlier in the day. The timing of my arrival just a coincidence. The lights in the canyon could have been reflections, or atmospheric effects, or the headlights of vehicles on distant roads somehow bouncing off mineral deposits in the rock. By the time I reached my motel room, I'd almost convinced myself that everything had a logical explanation. I showered, ordered a pizza, and spent an hour uploading the day's photographs to my laptop. The images looked normal, beautiful even. Golden light on red stone, dramatic shadows, the kind of landscapes that made people fall in love with the desert. Nothing in the pictures suggested anything supernatural or even unusual had occurred. I was closing the laptop when I remembered the radio incident and decided to review the audio recordings I'd made during the day. I'd been using a small digital recorder to document my route and timing, a habit I'd developed after getting lost on a previous solo trip. The device had been running for most of the afternoon, clipped to my pack strap where it could pick up my occasional spoken notes about landmarks and navigation. The early recordings were exactly what I expected. My own voice describing GPS coordinates, noting interesting rock formations, commenting on the temperature and wind conditions. But as I fast-forwarded through the files, looking for the moment when I'd first heard my father's voice, something began to go wrong with the playback. My voice started to multiply. At first it was subtle, a slight echo that could have been a processing artifact or a problem with the recorder's compression algorithm. But as the afternoon progressed, the effect became more pronounced. By the time I reached the recordings from deep in the slot canyon, I could hear multiple versions of my own voice speaking simultaneously, sometimes saying the same words, sometimes saying different things entirely. GPS reading shows, one voice would begin, while another was saying, temperature dropping, and a third was muttering something I couldn't quite make out. It was like listening to a conversation between multiple versions of myself, each one slightly out of sync with the others. But the most disturbing part came at the very end of the recording, during the time when I thought I'd turned the radio off. The device had apparently continued running even after I'd reached the rim of the canyon, and it had captured something that made my hands shake as I listened. My own voice, speaking in perfect unison with itself, saying words I didn't remember speaking. Almost there, kiddo. Just a little further. The same phrase my father had supposedly called to me in the canyon, but spoken in my own voice. Multiple copies of my own voice, creating a chorus that emerged from the speakers like sound, rising from the throat of something vast and hollow. I played the segment back 3 times, adjusting the volume and trying to convince myself it was some kind of audio artifact. But there was no denying what I was hearing. It was definitely my voice, not my father's, not some stranger's, not a distorted echo or electronic glitch. It was me, speaking words I'd never said, in tones I'd never used, calling myself by my childhood nickname in the exact cadence my father had always employed. I sat in the motel room until dawn, staring at the audio files on my laptop screen, trying to understand what I'd recorded. The logical explanations felt increasingly hollow as I listened to the chorus of my own voices emerging from speakers, like a congregation of ghosts. Outside my window, the desert slowly lightened from black to purple to gold, and somewhere in the distance, slot canyons that had been carved by water and time, waited in the growing heat for the next visitor to discover what kinds of sounds their throats could make. The recording ended with what sounded like laughter. My own laughter, multiplied and harmonized and stretched until it became something that had never been meant for human ears. And underneath it all, barely audible but undeniably present, the faint electronic beeping of an emergency radio that I was certain I had turned off hours before. I never went back to confirm whether the handprints were still there in the dust at the canyon's rim. Some questions, I realized, weren't meant to be answered. Some echoes were better left to fade on their own, in the vast silence of places where sound travels in ways that physics cannot explain, and where the only voice you can trust might not be the one coming from your own throat. Story 3. The desert wind carries strange frequencies at night, and I've learned to listen for them during my drives between Phoenix and the scattered towns along I-17. What I heard that Tuesday evening wasn't wind. I'd been running rides for 3 years, mostly the Phoenix to Flagstaff corridor, picking up travelers who needed transport between the urban sprawl and the isolated communities nestled in Arizona's high country. The money was decent, the roads familiar, and the passengers usually kept to themselves. That evening started like any other, with my phone buzzing near Black Canyon City and a ride request popping up on my screen. The pickup location sat just off the highway, a gravel pullout where truckers sometimes parked overnight. A single figure waited in the gathering dusk, holding what looked like a large briefcase. As I pulled closer, my headlights swept across him, revealing someone in his 30s wearing dark clothes and sunglasses despite the fading light. The briefcase, I realized, was actually a sleek black case with padding and metallic clasps, the kind used for expensive equipment. He climbed into the back seat without a word, placing the case carefully beside him. When I asked for his destination, he mentioned a testing facility somewhere off the highway, giving me coordinates instead of an address. The GPS accepted them readily enough, plotting a route that would take us deeper into the desert, away from the main thoroughfare. That's when the clicking started. At first, I thought he was adjusting his seatbelt, but the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Click, click, pause, click, click, pause, like Morse code, or perhaps some kind of signal. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, his hands were moving near his waist, but I couldn't quite see what he was manipulating. "Could you keep the headlights on low beam?" he asked suddenly, his voice carrying an odd metallic quality, as if spoken through a filter. The high beams interfere with tracking systems. I dimmed the lights without questioning him, though something about the request made my skin crawl. Tracking systems? What kind of testing facility needed to worry about car headlights interfering with their equipment? The desert around us seemed to pulse with invisible energy, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The GPS directed us off I-17 onto a smaller highway, and that's when things began to feel wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The mile markers should have been counting up as we traveled north, but instead they seemed to repeat: 212, 213, 214, then back to 212 again. I blinked hard, thinking fatigue was playing tricks on my eyes, but the pattern continued. My passenger had gone quiet except for the clicking, which never ceased. It synchronized with something, my heartbeat perhaps, or the rhythm of the tires on asphalt. The sound began to feel invasive, as if it were programming something inside my head. "How much further?" I asked, needing to break the oppressive silence. "The facility adjusts its location based on atmospheric conditions," he replied without looking up from whatever device he was manipulating. "We'll know when we arrive." The GPS began behaving erratically, offering the same 2 exit options repeatedly despite our forward motion. "Exit 42A or exit 42B," it would announce, then moments later repeat the same choice. The screen flickered occasionally, showing our location jumping backward and forward along the highway like a glitch in reality itself. I tried to focus on driving, but peripheral vision kept catching movement in the desert. Lights that shouldn't exist, shapes that resolved into nothing when I looked directly at them. The clicking continued its relentless pattern, and I began to suspect it wasn't coming from my passenger's seatbelt at all, but from something electronic in that case. My phone, mounted on the dashboard, showed our route as a straight line on the map application, but the estimated arrival time kept changing wildly. 7 minutes, then 43, then 2 hours, then 7 minutes again. I mentioned this to my passenger, but he seemed unsurprised. "Time dilates near test sites," he said matter-of-factly. "Quantum field fluctuations affect temporal perception. You'll adjust." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Quantum field fluctuations? What kind of rideshare passenger talked like that? I started to wonder if I'd picked up someone dangerous, someone involved in activities I didn't want to know about. The desert landscape began to feel more oppressive with each mile. Normally, I found the open spaces calming, but tonight the darkness seemed to press against the windows like living thing. Stars that should have been constant appeared to flicker and shift position, and the moon looked wrong somehow. Too bright, casting shadows that moved independently of their objects. My hands started trembling on the steering wheel. The clicking had become hypnotic, almost subliminal, and I caught myself nodding along to its rhythm. When I realized what was happening, I shook my head violently, trying to clear whatever influence was seeping into my thoughts. "Are you feeling the resonance?" my passenger asked, his voice now definitely coming through some kind of electronic modulation. Most subjects experience initial disorientation. Subjects? I wanted to demand an explanation, but my mouth felt thick and unresponsive. The word subjects implied testing, experimentation, things I definitely hadn't signed up for when I accepted this ride. I started looking for somewhere to turn around, but the highway stretched endlessly in both directions with no visible exit ramps. That's when I noticed the other vehicles. At first, they appeared to be normal traffic. A truck in the distance, a car in the oncoming lane. But they never got closer or fell behind. They maintained perfect spacing, like an escort formation. When I sped up, they matched my speed. When I slowed down, they adjusted accordingly. In my mirrors, I could see at least 3 vehicles maintaining precise distances behind us. Panic began to set in. I reached for my phone to call someone, anyone, but found the screen displaying information I hadn't entered. Our route was now marked as Active Test Protocol 7 Delta, and the estimated arrival time showed as Calibration in Progress. The map itself had changed, showing roads that didn't exist, and geographic features I didn't recognize. "Protocol requires passenger cooperation," my passenger said, though I hadn't spoken. "Resistance only prolongs the calibration period." I tried to pull over, but discovered I couldn't move my arms properly. They felt heavy, unresponsive, as if controlled by someone else's nervous system. The clicking had evolved into something more complex, a pattern that seemed to bypass my conscious mind and interface directly with my motor functions. Through growing terror, I managed to share my location with my emergency contacts, though I wasn't sure if the message actually sent. The phone screen kept flickering between normal displays and incomprehensible readouts showing wavelengths, frequency ranges, and what looked like brain scan data. In desperation, I spotted a highway patrol station ahead and managed to steer toward it through sheer force of will. As soon as I pulled into the parking lot, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift slightly. The clicking stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing and the engine cooling. I turned to confront my passenger, but the back seat was empty. The door hung open, though I hadn't heard it open. Only the black case remained, sitting exactly where he had placed it. My hands shook as I reached for the case. The latches opened with soft mechanical clicks, the same sounds I'd been hearing throughout the ride. Inside, nestled in foam padding, lay a single cassette tape. On its label, written in careful block letters, was my license plate number. Nothing else. No explanation, no equipment, no indication of what kind of test I'd supposedly participated in. Just a tape with my car's identification number written in hand that looked disturbingly like my own. I drove home in silence, windows down, radio off, trying to process what had happened. The normal route took exactly the time it should have, with mile markers counting properly and GPS functioning normally. Traffic moved in predictable patterns, and the stars remained fixed in their proper positions. but the questions multiplied with each mile. How had my passenger disappeared so completely? Who had written my license plate number on that tape? And why did the handwriting look so familiar? At home, I stared at the cassette for hours, afraid to play it. I'd thrown away my old tape player years ago, but found one at a thrift store the next morning. My hands trembled as I inserted the tape and pressed play. Static filled the room, then my own voice began speaking words I'd never said, describing a route I'd never taken, to a facility that might not exist. The recording detailed coordinates, protocols, and something called Phase 2 Initiation. Most disturbing of all, it described my own behavioral patterns with clinical precision, as if I were a subject being studied. The recording ended with my voice saying, "Subject demonstrates acceptable compliance levels. Recommend advancement to active testing phase." That evening, my phone rang. The caller ID showed my own number. I answered without thinking, and heard my own voice ask, "Are you ready for the test?" The line went dead before I could respond. Since then, I've stopped driving the I-17 corridor. I've changed my phone number, moved apartments, and started working different routes. But sometimes, late at night, I'll catch myself clicking rhythms with my fingers, the same pattern I heard in my car that evening. And occasionally, passing reflective surfaces, I glimpse someone wearing dark sunglasses in the back seat of my car. The black case sits in my closet, unopened since that first night. Sometimes I hear clicking sounds coming from inside it, soft and rhythmic, like a mechanical heartbeat counting down to something I'm not sure I want to understand. I've never determined whether what happened was real or some kind of psychological break. The only evidence is the tape, the case, and the persistent feeling that somewhere in the desert, a test is still running, and I'm still part of it. The worst part isn't wondering what happened to me that night. It's wondering what happens next, and whether I'll recognize it when it begins. Story 4. The studio apartment in Denver wasn't much to look at. 400 square feet of exposed brick and questionable plumbing crammed into what used to be a warehouse. But the rent was right, and after 6 months of sleeping on my brother's couch, even the persistent rattle of the central heating system felt like luxury. The landlord, a weathered man with paint-stained fingers, handed me the keys with a shrug and mentioned something about the previous tenant leaving. In a hurry, I should have asked more questions. The first week passed without incident. I unpacked my meager belongings, arranged my desk near the single window overlooking the alley, and tried to ignore the way the heating system wheezed and clanked through the walls like something trying to escape. The unit kicked on every few hours, sending warm air through the overhead ducts with a sound that reminded me of labored breathing. It was during that initial settling period that I found the board. Tucked behind the radiator, wrapped in what looked like an old pillowcase, was a piece of particle board about the size of a paperback book. Someone had burned letters into its surface with what must have been a wood-burning tool, creating a crude but deliberate message. Ask the house. Below that, arranged in a circle, were the letters of the alphabet, with yes and no positioned at opposite corners. I'd seen enough movies to recognize a makeshift Ouija board, though this one looked less like a toy and more like something born from desperation. The wood was worn smooth in places, as if from repeated use, and the burn marks had that deep, permanent quality that comes from time and intention. Part of me wanted to toss it in the dumpster outside, but curiosity won out. I slipped it into my desk drawer and tried to forget about it. That lasted exactly 3 days. I was reviewing quarterly reports when I first noticed the condensation. A dark stain had appeared on the ceiling above my desk, right where the main heating duct ran through the exposed beams. At first glance, it looked like ordinary water damage, the kind of thing you'd expect in a converted warehouse. But as I stood on my desk chair to get a closer look, the smell hit me, metallic and sharp, like old pennies left in rainwater. The stain itself wasn't quite black, but a deep brownish red that seemed to shift depending on the light. When I pressed a paper towel against it, the moisture that came away had that same copper tang, leaving my fingers feeling grimy in a way that soap couldn't quite wash clean. I called the landlord, who promised to send someone to look at it. Days passed. The stain grew larger, spreading across the ceiling in irregular patterns that reminded me of road maps or river deltas. The smell intensified whenever the heating system kicked on, as if the warm air was somehow activating whatever was seeping through. That's when I decided to try the board. I told myself it was just curiosity, maybe a little loneliness talking. But as I sat cross-legged on my hardwood floor at 11:30 p.m., fingertips resting lightly on the rim of a coffee mug I'd placed on the makeshift planchette, I felt something shift in the apartment's atmosphere. The usual sounds, traffic from the street, the neighbor's television through the thin walls, seemed to fade, leaving only the steady whisper of air through the vents. The first question felt ridiculous even as I asked it. Is anyone there? Nothing happened for a long moment. Then, so gradually I almost missed it, the mug began to slide across the board's surface. It moved with deliberate purpose, pausing over letters with the kind of precision that made my skin crawl. Y-E-S. I jerked my hands back as if the mug had suddenly turned hot. But after a few minutes of sitting in the resulting silence, I placed my fingers back on the ceramic rim and asked what I really wanted to know. What's in the ceiling? This time the response came quicker, the mug gliding across the warped particle board with an ease that defied physics. M.E. The heating system chose that moment to rumble to life, sending a blast of warm air through the overhead ducts. But this time the sound was different. Underneath the mechanical wheeze, I could swear I heard something else. A rhythm that sounded almost like breathing. Slow, deliberate inhalations and exhalations that seemed to come from the very bones of the building. I packed the board away and went to bed, but sleep came in fragments. Every time the heating kicked on, I found myself listening for that breathing pattern, trying to convince myself it was just the settling of old pipes and ductwork. It was at 2:13 a.m. that I first saw the writing. I'd gotten up to use the bathroom, padding across the cold floor in bare feet. The small mirror above the sink was fogged with condensation from the shower I'd taken hours earlier, and as I reached for the light switch, I froze. Someone had traced letters into the moisture on the glass, not random patterns or accidental marks, but deliberate words written in what looked like a child's handwriting. Colfax. I knew that street. It ran east-west through the heart of Denver, a main artery that connected downtown to the suburbs. But seeing it spelled out on my bathroom mirror at 2 a.m. made my throat constrict with an irrational fear. I wiped the mirror clean with my sleeve, but the next night, the words appeared again. Different this time. 17th Avenue, then Broadway, then Spear Boulevard, always at 2:13 a.m., always in that same childish scrawl, always the names of streets I recognized from my daily commute through the city. By the end of the second week, I'd started leaving my phone's camera running in the bathroom, hoping to catch whatever was happening. But the recording showed nothing. Just an empty mirror that somehow fogged itself in a room where no one had showered for hours, developing those impossible words letter by letter while the camera watched. The stain on the ceiling continued to spread, now covering an area roughly the size of a dinner table. The copper smell had evolved into something more complex. Pennies and rust, yes, but underneath that was something organic and unsettling, like earth after rain, or the smell that lingers in a room where someone has been sick. I found myself spending less time at home, working late at the office or lingering in coffee shops until they closed. But the apartment was always waiting, and with it, that sense of being observed by something patient and persistent. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in my third week there. I'd been avoiding the board since that first session, keeping it locked in my desk drawer like some kind of containment protocol. But the daily messages on the mirror had worn down my resolve, and I needed answers more than I needed comfort. This time, I didn't bother with pleasantries. "What do you want from me?" The response came immediately, the mug sliding across the board with an eagerness that made my hands shake. S-T-A-Y. Why? H-O-M-E. This isn't my home. The mug paused, hovering over the board's center as if considering its next move. When it resumed sliding, the message came in fragments, one letter at a time with long pauses between. W-A-S-M-I-N-E-F-I-R-S-T. I asked who it was, where it came from, how long it had been there. but each question received the same response: stay. Sometimes the mug would circle the board frantically, spelling the word over and over until I pulled my hands away and stumbled backwards. The heating system had started running almost constantly now, filling the apartment with that rhythmic breathing sound that seemed to sync with my own heartbeat. The stain on the ceiling had taken on a different quality, the brown-red moisture seeming to pulse with a life of its own. That night I packed a bag. I told myself it was temporary, just a few days at a motel until I could figure out what was happening. Maybe I was stressed from the move, working too many hours, letting my imagination run wild in an unfamiliar place. But as I folded clothes into my suitcase, I felt an almost physical resistance, as if the air itself was thickening around me. The mirror I'd bought to replace the bathroom fixture went into the suitcase last. I'd grown paranoid about leaving it behind, convinced that whatever was writing on it might somehow follow me if I left it in the apartment. Better to keep it close, where I could control it. I was wrong. The motel room was clean and anonymous, with industrial carpet and the kind of heater that clicked on and off throughout the night. I should have felt safe there, surrounded by mundane fixtures and the distant sound of highway traffic. Instead, I found myself checking the windows obsessively, making sure the deadbolt was secure, listening for sounds that didn't belong. On the second night, I unpacked the mirror to brush my teeth. The moisture appeared immediately, condensation forming on the glass as if the room's humidity had suddenly spiked. I watched in the artificial light of the bathroom as letters traced themselves across the surface. S-T-A-Y. Then, below that, C-O-M-E, H-O-M-E. I drove back to the apartment the next morning, telling myself I was being ridiculous. But as I climbed the stairs to my studio, I could hear the heating system running, could smell that copper earth odor seeping through the door. The stain on the ceiling had spread further in my absence, now covering nearly a quarter of the space above my bed. And sitting on my desk, arranged in a perfect circle, were letters cut from newspaper and magazines. Welcome home. I called in sick to work and spent the day researching the building's history at the public library. The records were incomplete, but I found enough fragments to piece together a timeline. The warehouse had been converted to apartments in the 1980s, with my particular unit carved out of what used to be a storage area. Before that, it had housed everything from auto parts to restaurant supplies, but it was the death records that made my hands start shaking. 3 previous tenants in my unit had died under what the reports called mysterious circumstances. Not violence or accident, just found dead in their sleep, with no obvious cause and no signs of struggle. The last one, a man whose name I won't repeat, had been discovered by the landlord after neighbors complained about a smell. The newspaper clipping was dated 6 months ago. I drove back to the motel that afternoon, but this time I left everything behind. Clothes, furniture, even my laptop. I wanted nothing from that place following me. But as I lay in the anonymous darkness of room 237, listening to the traffic on I-25, I knew it wouldn't matter. The mirror had already started fogging. Now I live in hotels and furnished rentals, moving every few weeks, never staying anywhere long enough to feel settled. I've thrown away dozens of mirrors, but new ones always develop that telltale condensation. Sometimes it's bathroom fixtures, sometimes it's car windows, sometimes it's the glass doors of refrigerators in convenience stores. The message is always the same: stay. And sometimes, late at night when the heating systems kick on in whatever temporary place I'm calling home, I hear that breathing in the walls. Slow and patient and constant, as if something is waiting for me to finally stop running and come back to where I belong. The copper smell follows me too, faint but persistent, like old pennies in my pocket or rust water in my coffee. I've started avoiding places with central heating, but even electric baseboard units seem to carry that whisper of artificial respiration. I know what you're thinking. Stress, isolation, maybe a gas leak causing hallucinations. I've considered all the rational explanations. Visited doctors who prescribed everything from anxiety medication to sleep studies. But rationality doesn't explain the messages that appear on mirrors I've never touched, or the way my current hotel room's thermostat occasionally clicks on by itself, even though I've never adjusted it. Last week I found a real estate listing in my email inbox for a studio apartment in Denver. The address was familiar, though I couldn't place it at first. Then I recognized the exposed brick in the photos, the single window overlooking the alley, the weathered hardwood floors. The rent had gone down since I lived there, significantly. The listing mentioned that the unit was recently renovated, with improved ventilation systems and updated fixtures. There was no mention of the previous tenants, of course, or the reason for the sudden availability. But at the bottom of the listing, in small print that might have been a typo, was a single word: stay. I deleted the email, but it reappeared in my inbox the next morning, and the morning after that. Each time with a different subject line: your dream home awaits. Perfect match for your needs. Welcome back. But always the same property, always the same subliminal message. I'm writing this from a coffee shop in Salt Lake City, where I'm planning to catch a bus to anywhere that isn't Colorado. The mirror in the public restroom has been fog-free all morning, which should be reassuring. But I know it's temporary. They always start clear, and they always end the same way. The truth is, I'm running out of money and places to run. The constant moving, the hotel bills, the inability to hold a steady job when you're always looking over your shoulder. It's wearing me down in ways I didn't anticipate. And there's something else, something I haven't wanted to admit even to myself. Part of me wants to go back, not because I believe the messages or think there's actually something waiting for me in that studio apartment, but because running is exhausting, and Denver is starting to feel like the only place where things make sense, even if that sense is terrifying. I've started dreaming about the apartment again. Not nightmares exactly, but vivid recollections of sitting at my desk while the heating system breathes through the walls, of watching the stain on the ceiling spread like roots or veins, of feeling observed but not necessarily threatened. In the dreams, I never leave. I stay and learn to live with the messages on the mirror, with the breathing in the vents, with the growing certainty that I'm sharing my space with something that was there first. In the dreams, it doesn't seem so bad. When I wake up, I tell myself that's just exhaustion talking. But the feeling lingers throughout the day, a persistent whisper that maybe the running is more frightening than whatever I left behind. The bus to Portland leaves in an hour. My ticket is in my pocket, my bag is by my feet, and I have enough cash to start over somewhere new. Again. But as I finish writing this, I can see my reflection in the coffee shop window beginning to fog with condensation despite the dry mountain air, and I know that wherever I go, the messages will follow. The breathing in the walls will continue. The smell of old pennies will cling to my clothes no matter how many times I wash them. Maybe it's time to stop running. Maybe it's time to go home. Story 5. The fluorescent lights in the motel lobby hummed their familiar tune, a mechanical lullaby that had become the soundtrack to my isolation. 23 years I'd been running the Crossroads Inn, a forgotten way station on Highway 30, where truckers caught 4 hours of sleep and traveling salesmen counted their remaining miles. The building squatted against the Iowa landscape like a concrete tumor, its faded yellow paint peeling in strips that reminded me of sunburned skin. That Tuesday in October started like any other. The autumn wind carried the scent of dying corn through the parking lot, mixing with diesel fumes and the perpetual smell of industrial carpet cleaner that permeated everything inside. I'd settled into my usual routine: inventory at 6, maintenance rounds at 8, then the long stretch until dawn with only the television's blue glow and the occasional rumble of passing 18-wheelers for company. The sedan appeared at 11:47 p.m. I noticed it first as headlights in the distance, twin points of light that seemed to hover above the asphalt before resolving into an ordinary-looking car. Dark blue, maybe black, with tinted windows that reflected the motel's neon sign. It moved with deliberate slowness, as if the driver was studying every detail of the property before committing to the turn into our lot. When it finally pulled in, the engine's purr was too quiet, too smooth for something that had been traveling the highway. 3 doors opened simultaneously, and my chest tightened with an inexplicable dread. The figures that emerged moved with identical precision, their bodies lean and angular beneath dark clothing. Each carried a suitcase, the exact same model, size, and color. Even from behind the lobby's bulletproof glass, I could see they were expensive pieces, the kind with brushed aluminum corners and leather handles that cost more than most people's monthly rent. But it was their faces that made my skin crawl. Clear silicone masks covered their features, the kind you might see in a medical documentary about burn victims or facial reconstruction. The material was so transparent I could see the suggestion of eyes, noses, mouths beneath, but distorted enough that no human characteristics remained distinguishable. Low-pulled hoods completed the anonymity, casting shadows that seemed to swallow what little definition the masks allowed. They didn't approach the lobby. Instead, they separated with military precision, each figure heading toward a different wing of the motel. The one who'd emerged from the driver's side moved toward the east wing, where rooms 101 through 115 housed mostly empty spaces and broken dreams. The passenger took the west wing, home to our few long-term residents, drifters and disability checks and people who'd stopped moving forward somewhere along the line. The figure from the back seat disappeared around the building's rear, where the maintenance rooms and staff quarters created a maze of concrete corridors and flickering emergency lights. I reached for the phone to call out, maybe ask if they needed a room, but something in their purposeful movement made me hesitate. This wasn't the behavior of weary travelers seeking rest. These people had a plan. The Wi-Fi died at 11:52 p.m. Our internet was notoriously unreliable, so the outage didn't immediately concern me. But when I checked my phone to verify the connection, instead of our usual network, a new option had appeared. Crossroads Guest Secure. The signal was stronger than anything we'd ever broadcasted, and when I attempted to connect, it prompted me for a password and requested permission to access my camera and photo gallery. Every instinct screamed danger, but curiosity won. I declined the photo access and tried connecting anyway, only to be redirected to a page that insisted I provide identification verification, a clear photo of my driver's license and a current selfie. The web page's design was flawless, professional, bearing our motel's logo and color scheme with disturbing accuracy. Someone had created a perfect digital replica of our systems in less than 5 minutes. I tried calling the police, but my cell phone showed no signal despite the full bars displayed on the screen. The landline behind the desk produced only silence when I lifted the receiver, not even a dial tone. The emergency button beneath the cash register, connected directly to the county sheriff's dispatch, might as well have been a decorative ornament. I was alone, cut off, and being systematically isolated. The security monitors showed all 3 figures moving through the motel's corridors with impossible knowledge of the layout. They avoided the cameras with precision, appearing only at the edges of frames or in brief glimpses that revealed nothing useful. But their suitcases remained visible, and as they moved, I realized with growing horror that the cases were completely empty. They bounced too lightly in their grips, swayed without the weight that should have given them purpose. What were they collecting? By 12:30 a.m., the figures had completed their circuits and returned to the sedan. The engine started with the same unnatural smoothness, and they drove away at exactly the speed limit, their taillights disappearing into the darkness as abruptly as they'd arrived. The Wi-Fi returned moments later, our familiar weak signal resuming its usual struggle against the Iowa wind. My phone displayed normal service bars, and the landline offered its expected dial tone. I called the sheriff's department immediately, my voice shaking as I described the incident to Deputy Rodriguez, who'd answered countless calls from the Crossroads Inn over the years, mostly noise complaints and domestic disturbances from our transient population. He listened with professional patience, taking notes I could hear him scribbling, and promised to send a patrol car for a perimeter check. The deputy arrived within 20 minutes, his flashlight beam sweeping across the parking lot where the sedan had been parked. He examined the asphalt for tire tracks, checked the building's exterior for signs of forced entry, and walked the corridors where I'd seen the figures moving. His inspection was thorough, methodical, and completely fruitless. No footprints in the frost, he reported, shining his light on the thin layer of ice crystals that covered the grass between the parking lot and building. And I mean none. Not even yours, despite you saying you did a walk-around after they left. The statement hit me like a physical blow. I remembered stepping outside to check the perimeter, feeling the cold bite of autumn air against my face. But when I looked at the frost-covered ground, my memory seemed suddenly unreliable, distant, like trying to recall a dream after waking. Deputy Rodriguez spent another hour documenting the scene, photographing the area where the sedan had parked, testing our Wi-Fi network, and verifying that all room doors remained locked and undisturbed. His report would read, "Unfounded complaint," I knew. Another entry in the growing file of incidents that couldn't be explained or verified. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the lobby chair, watching the monitors and jumping at every shadow that passed across the screens. The motel felt different somehow, as if the building itself had been subtly altered during those 43 minutes of occupation. Sounds seemed amplified, the furnace cycling, pipes settling, the electrical hum that permeated the walls. But underneath these familiar noises, I began to detect something else, a rhythmic tapping, so faint it might have been my imagination, that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Morning brought no relief. The exhaustion should have been overwhelming, but instead I felt hyper-aware, my senses heightened to an uncomfortable degree. Every guest interaction seemed suspicious. The businessman in room 108 who paid in cash and wore sunglasses indoors. The woman in room 203 who claimed to be visiting family but had no luggage except a small backpack. The maintenance worker who appeared to fix a plumbing issue I hadn't reported. It was while reviewing the guest registry that afternoon that I found the photo. I'd been checking my phone for messages when the gallery app opened spontaneously, displaying an image I didn't remember taking. The timestamp showed 3:17 a.m., hours after the incident, during what should have been my vigilant watch in the lobby. But the photo showed me sleeping, lying on my back in what appeared to be my own bed in the manager's quarters. The master key to every room in the motel rested on my chest, positioned with deliberate care above my heart. The image was perfectly focused, professionally lit, taken from directly above with clinical precision. But I remembered sitting in the lobby chair all night, alert and watchful, never leaving my post. Yet there was my phone's metadata, confirming the timestamp, the location services placing the photo's origin within the building. There was the unmistakable view of my bedroom ceiling, with its water stain shaped like a bird in flight, and the smoke detector whose battery I'd been meaning to replace for months. The photo's existence was impossible, but the evidence was undeniable. I called in sick for the next 3 days, leaving the motel in the hands of my part-time assistant while I tried to make sense of what had happened. I reviewed every moment of that night, searching for gaps in my memory, explanations for the discrepancies. Had I fallen asleep in the chair and somehow wandered to my bed without remembering? Had someone drugged me, carried me to my room, staged the photo, then returned me to the lobby? But the security footage showed me sitting motionless in the lobby chair from midnight until dawn, never leaving, never sleeping, just staring at the monitors with unblinking attention. Yet that same footage also showed the timestamp when the photo was taken, a moment when I appeared to be in two places simultaneously. When I finally returned to work, the changes became more apparent. Guests reported strange experiences. Elevators stopping at floors they hadn't selected, room keys that opened the wrong doors, televisions that changed channels to display static-filled broadcasts of empty corridors that looked suspiciously like our own. The maintenance issues multiplied, electrical problems, plumbing failures, heating systems that cycled between Arctic cold and tropical heat without apparent cause. But it was the phones that bothered me most. Every few hours, one of the room phones would ring. When guests answered, they heard nothing but breathing, not quite human, mechanically regular, as if filtered through electronic equipment. The calls always came from extensions that didn't exist, numbers that corresponded to rooms we'd never built. Room 052, Room 300, Room 1A. The local phone company insisted their records showed no unusual activity on our lines. I began documenting everything: timestamps, room numbers, guest complaints, maintenance issues, any deviation from normal operations. The pattern that emerged was both subtle and terrifying. The incidents clustered around specific dates, always the 17th of each month. always beginning at 11:47 p.m., always lasting exactly 43 minutes. During these windows, the motel became something else. Guests who ventured into the corridors reported seeing figures in silicone masks moving between rooms, carrying empty suitcases, disappearing around corners that led nowhere. The Wi-Fi would fail and be replaced by increasingly sophisticated fake networks that requested more invasive permissions, access to banking apps, social media accounts, personal photographs and videos. I started sleeping with my phone in a Faraday cage, a metal box that blocked all signals. But each morning after an incident, new photos would appear in my gallery anyway. Images of myself sleeping, taken from impossible angles, showing rooms I didn't recognize but that felt eerily familiar. The masks in the photos became clearer over time, revealing features beneath the silicone that looked increasingly like my own face. Last week I found a suitcase in my closet. Expensive, brushed aluminum corners, leather handle. The exact same model I'd seen those three figures carrying. It was empty when I discovered it, but the weight felt wrong. Too heavy for empty space, too light for anything substantial. Inside the lid, embossed in letters I could barely see unless the light hit them exactly right, were the words, "Property of Crossroads Inn, Manager's Personal Effects." I don't remember buying the suitcase. I don't remember anyone giving it to me. But when I tried to remove it from my closet, my hands refused to cooperate, as if my body had learned to treat the case as essential, untouchable. Tonight is the 17th again. I'm writing this from the lobby, watching the monitors, waiting for 11:47 p.m. My phone is charging beside me, its gallery mysteriously empty of all the photos I've accumulated over the months. The suitcase sits by my feet, and though I can't bring myself to open it, I can hear something moving inside. Not the rattle of objects, but something that sounds disturbingly like breathing. The fluorescent lights are humming their familiar tune, but underneath, I can hear that rhythmic tapping again, growing stronger as the clock approaches the designated time. My reflection in the lobby's bulletproof glass looks strange tonight, distorted in ways that have nothing to do with the imperfections in the material. I think I'm beginning to understand what happened that first night, what's been happening every month since. The figures weren't collecting anything from the motel. They were delivering something. And I think that something was me. Story 6. The clicking follows me home now. Not every night, but enough that I've stopped sleeping with the windows open. Enough that I check the lock on my apartment door twice before bed, though I know no electric cart could climb 3 flights of stairs. The rational part of my mind, the part that earned me a maintenance certification and 15 years of steady work, knows this. But rationality has become a luxury I can't quite afford since that October evening in the steam tunnels beneath Whitmore College. It started as routine maintenance, the kind of job that barely registers in memory. The heating system at the college runs through a network of tunnels dug in the 1940s, concrete arteries that snake beneath the campus like fossilized veins. Most of the maintenance crew avoided tunnel work. Too cramped, too hot in winter, too many shadows that played tricks on tired eyes. But the pay differential was worth the discomfort, and I'd always prided myself on being practical about such things. My partner that evening was a quiet man from the night shift, whose name I've somehow managed to forget, though I remember everything else about that day with crystalline clarity. He was methodical in his work, the type who double-checked measurements and never cut corners. We'd been assigned to map the southern quadrant, updating blueprints that hadn't been revised since the Carter administration. The tunnel entrance behind the science building opened onto a main corridor wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast. Emergency lighting cast everything in harsh white intervals, creating pools of visibility separated by stretches of absolute darkness. The air moved differently down there, thick and heavy, carrying the metallic scent of old pipes and something else. Something organic that might have been mold or might have been something worse. We worked methodically, calling out measurements to each other as we moved deeper into the system. The tunnels branched and intersected according to no pattern I could discern, following the logic of necessity rather than design. Some passages led to mechanical rooms filled with the steady thrum of heating equipment. Others dead-ended at maintenance panels or storage alcoves that looked like they hadn't been opened in decades. It was in one of these dead ends that we found the cart. Electric maintenance vehicles weren't unusual in the tunnel system. The college used them for hauling equipment to remote locations where standard vehicles couldn't reach. But this one was different, older. The green paint had faded to a sickly yellow-gray, and rust bloomed across its frame like some aggressive skin condition. No keys in the ignition, no tools in the back, nothing to indicate why it had been abandoned in a passage that led nowhere. My partner suggested we should report it, but I was more interested in the tunnel that continued past the cart's resting place. According to our blueprints, the passage should have ended at the alcove, but the concrete walls kept going, disappearing into darkness that our flashlights couldn't penetrate. We followed it. The character of the tunnels changed as we moved deeper. The walls grew damper, and the sound of our footsteps began to behave strangely. Each step we took seemed to echo back twice, once immediately, as echoes should, and then again half a second later, as if someone behind us was matching our pace exactly. We stopped several times to listen, but the delayed footsteps always stopped too, leaving only the distant hum of machinery and the sound of our own breathing. My partner mentioned the acoustics. Some sort of sound well, he said, caused by the tunnel's shape and the moisture in the air. The explanation was reasonable, but it didn't make the phantom footsteps any less unsettling. Every few minutes I found myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see a third flashlight beam following us through the darkness. The fire doors trapped us during what should have been our route back to the surface. We'd mapped perhaps a quarter mile of previously uncharted tunnel when we decided to return to the main corridor, but the emergency doors, heavy steel barriers designed to contain fires or chemical spills, had somehow activated. They stood like monuments in the passageway, their surfaces reflecting our flashlight beams in harsh geometric patterns. No amount of pulling or pushing could budge them. The emergency release handles turned freely, but engaged nothing. My partner tried his radio, but the signal couldn't penetrate the concrete and steel surrounding us. We were effectively sealed in a section of tunnel that, according to the original blueprints, shouldn't have existed at all. That's when we heard the cart start up. The sound began as a low electrical whine, the kind made by old motors straining to overcome years of neglect. Then came the mechanical clicking, sharp, rhythmic, insistent. Through the darkness behind us, a strobing light began to pulse, casting wild shadows against the tunnel walls. Neither of us had touched the cart. Neither of us had seen keys in the ignition or any means of starting the ancient vehicle. But it was moving now. We could hear the electric whir of its motor growing closer, accompanied by that hypnotic strobe that turned the tunnel into a nightmare of flickering light and racing shadows. We ran. The tunnel system revealed itself to be far more complex than our blueprints suggested. Passages branched off in directions that shouldn't have been possible, given the surface geography we knew. Some led upward, following ramps that seemed to spiral through the earth like the interior of some vast shell. Others descended deeper, toward destinations we had no desire to discover. Behind us, the cart followed with mechanical persistence. The strobing light grew brighter when we slowed down, dimmer when we increased our pace, as if the vehicle was deliberately maintaining a specific distance. The clicking of the strobe became a metronome marking time in our underground flight, each flash revealing details of tunnels that grew stranger the farther we traveled from familiar territory. We discovered the salt quite by accident. During one of our brief rest stops, my flashlight beam picked out something white scattered across the tunnel floor near a drainage grate. Salt, coarse and gray, the kind used for de-icing roads. It had been spread in a rough circle around the grate, with additional lines extending outward like the points of a compass. Neither of us had brought salt into the tunnels. The maintenance inventory didn't include road salt, and even if it had, there was no reason for it to be arranged in such a deliberate pattern. The discovery should have been merely puzzling, but something about those white crystals filled me with a dread I couldn't explain. They looked like a warning, or perhaps a barrier, something meant to keep things in or keep things out. The cart had stopped. We noticed the silence first. No more electrical whining, no more strobing light cutting through the darkness behind us. When we looked back, we could see the vehicle perhaps 50 yards away, sitting motionless at what appeared to be a white line painted across the tunnel floor. The line was crisp and fresh, as if it had been applied recently, though we hadn't noticed anyone doing maintenance work in this section. The cart's strobe continued to flash, but the vehicle itself seemed unable or unwilling to cross that boundary. It waited there like some patient predator, its light pulsing in the darkness while we tried to understand what had just happened. My partner suggested we should investigate, try to understand why the cart had stopped. But I found myself backing away from both the vehicle and the white line, driven by an instinct I couldn't rationally explain. The arrangement felt wrong. The salt circle, the painted boundary, the cart waiting just beyond reach. These weren't random elements, but parts of some larger pattern that I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. We found our way out through a maintenance shaft that opened behind the campus amphitheater. The ladder was rusted and treacherous, but it led to blessed fresh air and the familiar landscape of the college grounds. Emergency crews found us there 20 minutes later, after the automatic fire door system had mysteriously reset itself, and maintenance supervisors realized we were missing. The official report blamed the incident on a malfunction in the tunnel's safety systems. Old wiring, corroded sensors, the kind of problems that plague buildings constructed decades before modern safety standards. The cart was removed and presumably scrapped, though no one seemed entirely sure how it had ended up in that particular tunnel, or why it had been running without keys. My partner transferred to day shift maintenance the following week and stopped speaking to me entirely. I continued working the tunnels, but I never found that section again. The passages I'd mapped so carefully seemed to have vanished, leaving only the standard tunnel network that matched the blueprints perfectly. But the clicking follows me home. Not every night, but often enough. I hear it in the walls of my apartment building, behind the sound of heating pipes and settling wood. Sometimes I catch the faint flicker of strobing light in my peripheral vision, reflecting off windows or mirrored surfaces. When I turn to look directly, there's never anything there. I've started carrying salt in my pockets, just a small amount in a plastic bag, nothing that would draw attention. I tell myself it's superstition, but I sleep better knowing it's there. Some nights, when the clicking seems particularly close, I sprinkle a thin line across my doorway before bed. The line is always undisturbed in the morning, but I've noticed that the clicking stops at my door, just like the cart stopped at that painted boundary in the tunnel. Whatever follows me respects barriers, at least for now. I've been thinking about that painted line more and more lately. Someone put it there. Someone who understood what the cart was and what it wanted. Someone who knew enough to use salt as protection and fresh paint as a boundary. But who? And more importantly, why did they leave us to discover it on our own? Last week I drove past Whitmore College on my way to a job in the next county. The campus looked normal. Students walking between classes, maintenance crews working on the grounds, everything exactly as it should be. But when I parked and walked behind the amphitheater, I could see the manhole cover I'd emerged from that October evening. It was painted white now, with a thick coat that gleamed wet in the afternoon sun. Fresh paint, applied recently. Someone is still maintaining those boundaries, still keeping whatever lives in the tunnels where it belongs. I wonder if they know about the clicking that follows me home. I wonder if they know that some barriers aren't as permanent as we'd like to believe. Tonight, I can hear it again, that rhythmic, mechanical pulse echoing through the walls of my building. It's closer than usual, perhaps only one floor below. I've checked my salt line twice, and it remains intact across my doorway. But salt and paint are human solutions to something that might not be entirely human. And I'm beginning to suspect that the cart in the tunnel wasn't the real threat at all, just a symptom of something larger, something that sees our protective barriers not as permanent walls, but as temporary inconveniences. The clicking is getting louder. I think it's learned to climb stairs. Story 7. The job posting had been simple enough. House sit for 3 days, while an antique dealer attended an estate sale in Charleston. Pet care included. The pay was generous, almost suspiciously so, but I needed the money, and Savannah in October seemed like a pleasant enough diversion from my cramped apartment back in Atlanta. The house on Bull Street stood like a monument to Southern Gothic excess. 3 stories of weathered brick and wrought iron, draped in Spanish moss that swayed without any discernible breeze. The owner, a thin man with pale eyes that never quite met mine, had introduced himself simply as the proprietor. He spoke in clipped sentences, as if words cost him something precious. "The dog stays inside," he'd said, handing me an ornate brass key that felt unnaturally cold. "Feed him twice daily. Walk him only in the courtyard, and the mirror in the main parlor." He'd pause then, his fingers drumming against the door frame. "Keep it covered. Family tradition." The Mastiff, a massive brindled creature named Bishop, had watched our exchange with intelligent amber eyes. He was beautiful in the way that powerful things often are, commanding respect through presence alone. As his owner's car disappeared down the cobblestone street, Bishop had padded directly to the parlor and stationed himself before what I assumed was the covered mirror. The first night passed without incident. Bishop ate his dinner with mechanical precision, followed me through my evening routine with the dedication of a security detail, and eventually settled onto an enormous cushion in the corner of my temporary bedroom. I'd been grateful for the company. The house creaked and settled with the persistence of old bones, and every shadow seemed to writhe in my peripheral vision. It was the second night when things began to unravel. I'd been reading in the parlor around 11, trying to ignore Bishop's increasing restlessness. The dog had been pacing for the better part of an hour, his nails clicking against the hardwood in a rhythm that set my teeth on edge. Finally, he'd stopped directly in front of the covered mirror and begun to stare. The covering was an elaborate tapestry, heavy and ornate, depicting some sort of hunting scene. Beneath it, I could make out the suggestion of an ornate frame, carved wood that caught and reflected the lamplight in ways that made it seem almost alive. Bishop's breathing had grown heavy, each exhale punctuated by a low, rumbling growl that seemed to emanate from somewhere deeper than his chest. "Easy, boy," I'd murmured, but the words felt hollow in the thick air of the parlor. That's when I'd noticed the smell. Something metallic and sharp, like copper pennies left in the rain. It grew stronger as the night wore on, until it seemed to coat the inside of my mouth and nose. Bishop's growling intensified, his massive frame rigid with tension. At 3:07 a.m., I remember checking my phone, the blue light harsh against the parlor's amber glow. Everything changed. The sound came first. A dry, scraping noise, like metal being dragged across glass. It seemed to originate from behind the tapestry, though logic insisted that was impossible. The mirror was flush against the wall. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. Yet the sound persisted, growing louder and more insistent, until it filled the entire room with its grating presence. Bishop's growling reached a fever pitch, his amber eyes fixed on the covered mirror with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I stood to investigate, my legs unsteady beneath me, when I heard the distinct click of my bedroom door locking. The sound was unmistakable, the heavy final sound of an old-fashioned deadbolt sliding home. Panic fluttered in my chest like a trapped bird. I'd left that door open. I was certain of it, and there was no key for the bedroom lock. I'd checked when I'd first arrived, but it was what happened next that truly unsettled me. The tapestry seemed to billow outward, as if pushed by some unseen force from behind. For a moment I caught a glimpse of what lay beneath, not the antique mirror I'd expected, but what appeared to be a long, narrow corridor stretching impossibly deep into darkness. At the far end, a pinpoint of light pulsed with a rhythm that matched the sudden hammering of my heart. The light was wrong. Not the steady glow of electricity or the warm flicker of flame, but something else entirely. Something that seemed to pull at my vision, drawing my gaze deeper into that impossible space. I found myself taking a step forward, then another, my rational mind screaming warnings that my body seemed unable to heed. That's when Bishop lunged. The massive dog threw himself between me and the mirror, his weight nearly knocking me to the ground. His presence broke whatever spell had been building, and I stumbled backward, my heart racing. The scratching sound grew more frantic, more desperate, as if something on the other side was clawing to get through. Working on pure instinct, I grabbed the first thing I could find, a heavy moving blanket draped over a nearby chair, and threw it over the tapestry-covered mirror. The effect was immediate and profound. The scratching stopped as if cut off by a switch. The metallic smell dissipated. Even Bishop's growling ceased, though he remained stationed protectively between me and the now doubly covered mirror. The silence that followed was absolute, and somehow more unsettling than the chaos that had preceded it. I spent the rest of the night in the parlor's armchair, staring at the blanketed mirror while Bishop maintained his vigil. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see that corridor stretching away into darkness, feel the pull of that pulsing light. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself it had been a stress-induced hallucination brought on by too much coffee and too little sleep in an unfamiliar environment. When the owner returned that afternoon, I'd mentioned the incident as casually as possible. His reaction was immediate and telling. His pale eyes had darted to the mirror, taking in the additional covering I'd provided, and something like relief had crossed his features. Family tradition, he'd repeated, but this time the words carried weight, as if they contained some deeper meaning I wasn't privy to. The piece has been in our possession for over a century. Victorian era. Beautiful craftsmanship, but... He trailed off, then fixed me with a stare that seemed to look right through me. Some objects carry more than just monetary value. Some carry impressions, echoes of previous owners. He'd paid me in cash, adding a substantial bonus that I hadn't questioned at the time. Only later, as I drove back toward Atlanta, did I realize he'd never actually confirmed or denied what I'd experienced. He'd simply nodded when I'd mentioned keeping the mirror covered, as if my actions had been both expected and necessary. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The third night, back in my own apartment in my own bed, I'd awakened to find my bedroom door standing wide open. I lived alone. I always slept with the door closed. A quick check revealed no signs of forced entry, no indication that anyone had been in my apartment. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, except for that door, and the smell, that same metallic copper penny scent that had filled the parlor in Savannah. I'd convinced myself it was psychological. Trauma response, stress manifesting in physical symptoms. I'd changed my locks, installed a security system, even consulted a therapist who'd assured me that such experiences were more common than I might think. Sleep disturbances, phantom smells, hypervigilance, all normal reactions to what she'd termed acute environmental stressors. But the dreams were harder to explain away. Every night, I found myself standing in that impossible corridor I'd glimpsed behind the mirror. The space was longer than any earthly architecture could accommodate, stretching away into a darkness so complete it seemed solid. The walls were smooth and reflective, like black glass, and in their surface I could see distorted versions of myself walking alongside me, some leading, some following, all slightly wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The light at the end pulsed in time with my heartbeat, just as it had that night in Savannah. Sometimes when I moved closer, I could make out shapes moving within that glow, silhouettes that might have been human, might have been something else entirely. They beckoned with movements that felt familiar, as if I'd performed those same gestures in some forgotten past. I'd wake with the taste of copper in my mouth, and the absolute certainty that I wasn't alone in my apartment. Not in any conventional sense. It was more as if the boundaries between spaces had begun to blur, as if that Victorian mirror had created some sort of aperture that followed me wherever I went. 3 weeks after Savannah, I began to notice the reflections. It started small, glimpses in storefront windows where my reflections seemed to lag behind my actual movements. Mirror elevators where I appeared to be standing slightly to the left or right of my actual position. Bathroom mirrors where my reflection occasionally moved independently, turning its head when mine was still, blinking when my eyes remained open. I started avoiding reflective surfaces altogether, but that proved impossible in a modern world built on glass and chrome. They were everywhere. Car windows, computer screens, the backs of spoons, puddles on the street, and in each one, that other version of myself grew more distinct, more confident, more real. The worst part was that no one else seemed to notice. Friends and colleagues carried on normal conversations, while my reflection gestured wildly behind them in restaurant windows. Strangers on the street walked past storefront displays, where my mirror self pounded silently against the glass, mouth open in what appeared to be a scream. I began to question not just my sanity, but the very nature of reality itself. Was I losing my mind, or had something in that Savannah parlor fundamentally altered my perception of the world? Had that mirror shown me something real, or had it triggered some latent psychological condition that manifested in increasingly elaborate hallucinations? The questions multiplied like viruses, each one spawning new doubts and fears. I'd researched the antique dealer's house, spending hours in digital archives and historical records. The property had changed hands frequently over the past century, often after the sudden departure of its occupants. Previous owners had cited atmospheric disturbances, persistent unease, and the feeling of being watched in their reasons for selling. Several had mentioned problems with mirrors and reflective surfaces. But was that evidence of something supernatural, or simply the power of suggestion working on people predisposed to anxiety and paranoia? The more I investigated, the less certain I became. Every piece of evidence could be interpreted multiple ways. Every witness account could be explained by psychological factors or social contagion. Even my own experiences might be nothing more than the brain's attempt to process stress through vivid hallucinations. Yet the reflections continued to grow stronger. Last week, I'd caught my mirror self reaching out of a department store window, its fingers pressing against the glass from the inside while I stood on the sidewalk. For just a moment, I could have sworn I felt something brush against my shoulder, a touch that was exactly wrong, exactly reversed, as if it had come from the opposite direction I expected. That night, I'd covered every reflective surface in my apartment with bed sheets and towels, just as I'd covered that Victorian mirror in Savannah. The effect was the same: immediate silence, immediate relief, but also immediate isolation, as if I'd cut myself off from some essential part of reality. I can't live like this forever. The covered mirrors make me feel safe, but they also make me feel trapped, as if I'm hiding from some fundamental truth about myself or the world. Every day, the temptation grows stronger to pull away those covers, to look directly into that reflected space and confront whatever waits there. Sometimes in the early morning hours when sleep finally threatens to claim me, I think I can hear that same dry scraping sound that filled the Savannah parlor. Metal against glass, something trying to get through, or something trying to get out. The most terrifying possibility isn't that I'm losing my mind. It's that I'm not. That what I experienced in that antique-filled house was real, and that by witnessing it, by failing to keep my eyes averted from that impossible corridor, I've somehow become part of it. In my darkest moments, I wonder if the reflection I see isn't some supernatural entity wearing my face, but the real me, trapped on the other side of every mirror, desperately trying to return to a world that grows more distant with each passing day. If the person typing these words, the one who sleeps in this bed and eats at this table, is nothing more than an echo, a shadow cast by someone else's light. Tonight, I'm going to uncover the mirrors, all of them. I need to know which side of the glass I truly belong on, even if the answer destroys everything I think I know about myself. The copper taste is already building in my mouth. The scratching sound has started again, soft but persistent, coming from somewhere behind the covered mirror in my bathroom. Whatever lives in that space between reflection and reality has been patient, but its patience is wearing thin. I think it's time we finally met face to face. After all, one of us isn't real. I just hope I'm not the one who's about to discover he's been living on the wrong side of the mirror all along. Story 8. CB radio crackled with static as I rolled past the Carson city limits, the diesel engine humming its familiar lullaby beneath 17 tons of freight bound for Reno. US 50 stretched ahead like a black ribbon thrown across the Nevada wasteland, and I'd driven this route enough times to know every pothole, every mile marker, every rest stop between here and the California border. They don't call it the loneliest road in America for nothing. The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m., when I spotted him standing under the flickering fluorescent light at the middle gate rest area. A figure in worn denim and a baseball cap, thumb extended toward the highway with the kind of casual confidence that suggested he'd been hitchhiking since before GPS made the world smaller. Something about his posture struck me as odd. Too still, too patient, like he knew exactly when the next truck would come along. I shouldn't have stopped. Company policy was clear about passengers, and my insurance wouldn't cover complications. But there's an unspoken code among night drivers, a recognition that the desert can swallow a man whole if he's not careful. The air brakes hissed as I pulled over, and he jogged up to the passenger side with surprising agility for someone I'd pegged as middle-aged. "Appreciate it," he said, climbing into the cab with practiced ease. His voice carried the kind of desert rasp that comes from years of dry wind and sparse conversation. "Going toward Reno?" I nodded, checking my mirrors before pulling back onto the empty highway. "Far as I'm headed." He settled into the passenger seat like he belonged there, adjusting the air vent with familiar motions. The dome light had flickered on briefly when he opened the door, and I'd caught a glimpse of weathered features and eyes that seemed older than his face. Now, in the dashboard's green glow, he looked like any other late-night traveler seeking a ride through the nothing. "You drive this stretch often?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that made me glance over. "3 times a week for the past 2 years. He was quiet for a moment, watching the desert roll past the passenger window. The headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, revealing scrub brush and the occasional reflective eyes of some nocturnal creature. "Then you know the roads out here got moods." I almost laughed. "Moods? Some nights they're cooperative. Take you where you need to go, smooth and straight." He adjusted his cap, pulling the brim lower. "Other nights, they got their own ideas about direction." The way he said it made something cold settle in my stomach. "You talking about construction detours?" "Construction." He repeated the word like it tasted strange. "Sure, that's what they call it." We drove in silence for another 10 miles, the CB occasionally crackling with distant trucker chatter from the interstate. I was starting to relax when he spoke again. "You ever see the blue cattle?" This time I did laugh, though it came out shakier than I intended. Blue cattle? Graze on the asphalt after midnight, usually around mile marker 47, sometimes farther east, near the old mining roads. He was staring straight ahead now, his voice matter of fact. "They don't move for traffic, just stand there chewing, blue as summer sky." The speedometer showed 68 millimeters, cruise control holding steady. The yellow dividing line disappeared under my hood in rhythmic pulses, hypnotic in the way that long night drives always become. I found myself checking the mile markers more carefully now, though I told myself it was just curiosity. "There's a business loop coming up in about 20 miles, he continued. "Takes you through what's left of Coaldale. Used to be a mining town before the silver played out." He turned to look at me directly, and in the dashboard's light, his eyes seemed to reflect like an animal's. "Don't take that loop." "Why not?" "Because some places are meant to stay empty." The GPS unit mounted on my dashboard began recalculating just as he finished speaking. The mechanical voice announced a route change due to road conditions ahead, directing me to take exit 67 to the Coaldale business loop. The coincidence made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. "Funny timing," I said, but he was already shaking his head. "Not funny at all." The exit ramp appeared in my headlights exactly where the GPS had predicted, a dark tongue of asphalt curving away from the main highway. A green sign announced Coaldale, 3 miles, in reflective letters that seemed to glow with their own light. The GPS cheerfully informed me that this route would save 14 minutes. I slowed the truck, preparing to take the exit. "Don't." His voice was sharp now, urgent. "Trust me on this. I've got a delivery schedule to keep. You've got a life to keep." Something in his tone made me accelerate past the exit ramp. The GPS immediately began recalculating again, its electronic voice tinged with what almost sounded like irritation. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but the passenger's obvious relief was palpable. "Smart choice," he said. "You can let me out at the next rest area." but there was no next rest area. We drove for another 30 miles, and the GPS kept insisting I turn around, take the next exit, find an alternate route to the business loop. Each recalculation seemed more insistent than the last, the voice becoming clearer, more urgent. I finally turned the volume down, and then off entirely. That's when the CB radio came alive. The voice that emerged from the speaker wasn't speaking English, but it wasn't Spanish either. The words came in pairs, each phrase repeated twice with mechanical precision. The language sounded old, angular, full of consonants that seemed to catch in the speaker's throat. And underneath the words I could hear something else, a low humming, like electricity running through power lines. Vash Kelm Nethro, Vash Kelm Nethro. My passenger had gone rigid in his seat. Torhen Vash Gulm, Torhen Vash Gulm. What the hell is that? I reached for the CB handset, but he grabbed my wrist. Don't answer. The voice continued its strange litany, each phrase spoken twice before moving to the next. It wasn't giving trucker directions or asking for assistance. It was giving instructions, I realized. Coordinates maybe, or waypoints. And every few minutes, it would pause and wait, as if expecting a response. I tried changing channels, but the voice followed. It seemed to be coming from every frequency at once, filling the cab with its alien rhythm. My passenger had pulled his cap down over his eyes and was muttering something under his breath that sounded almost like a prayer. Keleth Mor Vashni. Keleth Mor Vashni. The words seemed to vibrate in my chest, and I noticed my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Without thinking, I began to slow down. Keep driving, he said. Don't stop. Don't turn around. Just keep driving west. But the GPS had turned itself back on, and now it was showing a route I'd never seen before. Instead of following US 50, it displayed a series of back roads and county routes that seemed to spiral inward toward a central point marked only with a red dot. The estimated arrival time kept changing. 23 minutes, then 45, then 12, as if the destination itself was moving. This isn't right, I said. These roads aren't on any map. He was staring at the GPS screen now, and his face had gone pale. Turn around. Now. I checked my mirrors and began to slow, looking for a safe place to make a U-turn. But as I did, I noticed something wrong with the mile markers. The last one I'd seen clearly was mile 34, but now they were passing too quickly, and the numbers seemed to be counting backward. Mile 29, then 24, then 19, each post flashing by in the headlights like a countdown, and they were all freshly painted. White paint covered the original numbers, applied recently enough that I could smell the chemical tang through the truck's air conditioning. The CB voice had grown louder, more insistent. Vash Kelm Nethro Vaskul, Vash Kelm Nethro Vaskul. I found a wide spot in the road and executed a careful three-point turn, the trailer swinging wide in the darkness. As soon as I was facing east again, the voice stopped. The CB went silent except for the usual background static, and the GPS screen flickered back to normal, showing US 50 as a simple straight line across Nevada. My passenger let out a long breath. Good. Now take the old road. What old road? He pointed to what looked like a faint depression in the desert floor, barely visible in the starlight. There. Used to be the original highway before they rerouted through the valley. I almost protested that I couldn't see any road at all, but as I stared into the darkness, the faint parallel lines became clearer. 2 tracks worn into the hardpan, wide enough for a vehicle but unmarked by any signs or reflectors. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades. You're sure about this? More sure than I've been about anything in a long time. I turned onto the abandoned road, the truck lurching slightly as the tires found the uneven surface. The headlights revealed scattered rocks and sparse vegetation, but the path was surprisingly solid. We drove in silence for what felt like hours, though the dashboard clock seemed to be moving erratically, sometimes fast, sometimes barely crawling forward. The painted mile markers continued along this route too, I noticed. Each one carefully obscured with white paint, as if someone had methodically erased every reference point along the way. The effect was deeply unsettling, like driving through a landscape where geography itself had been deliberately confused. "How do you know about this road?" I asked. He was quiet for so long I thought he hadn't heard me. Then, "I used to live out here, before they changed things." "Changed what?" "The way the roads work." Dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern horizon when the old road finally reconnected with US 50. The transition was so gradual, I almost missed it. One moment we were bumping along the forgotten track, the next we were back on smooth asphalt with proper lane markings and reflectors. It was like emerging from a tunnel I hadn't realized we'd entered. "This is good," he said. "You can drop me here." There was nothing here, just empty desert stretching in all directions, not even a mailbox or dirt road to mark human presence. But he was already reaching for the door handle. "You sure? It's got to be 20 miles to the nearest town." "I'll manage." He paused with one foot on the running board. "Check your logbook when you get to Reno. Compare your mileage with what the odometer shows." Before I could ask what he meant, he was walking away into the desert, not following any visible path. I watched in the side mirror until the morning haze swallowed him completely. I drove the remaining 40 miles to Reno in a strange state of detachment, as if the whole night had been someone else's experience. The delivery went smoothly. Routine paperwork, familiar loading dock, the usual small talk with the warehouse crew. But when I climbed back into the cab to head home, I found something that hadn't been there before. A map was tucked behind the sun visor on the passenger side, folded neatly, and held in place by a rubber band. It showed the familiar outline of Nevada counties, but there were no city names, no road numbers, no geographic features marked. Just the boundary lines drawn in black ink, and a single red cross marked with a ballpoint pen in what I calculated to be roughly where we'd encountered the business loop. I unfolded the map completely, spreading it across the passenger seat. The paper felt old, brittle at the creases, and it smelled faintly of something I couldn't identify. Something organic and unpleasant. The county lines were accurate, I could see that much, but everything else was blank. No towns, no highways, no landmarks. Just empty spaces between the borders, as if the entire state had been wiped clean and was waiting for someone to decide what should go there. The red cross was drawn with deliberate precision, the lines intersecting at perfect right angles. But as I stared at it, I began to notice something else. The ink seemed slightly wet, as if it had been drawn recently, and around the cross, almost too faint to see, were other markings. Tiny symbols that looked like letters from no alphabet I recognized. I folded the map quickly and shoved it into the glove compartment, but I could still smell that strange organic odor. It lingered in the cab for the entire drive home, growing stronger when I turned on the air conditioning, as if the ventilation system was circulating something that wasn't quite air. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I've driven the US 50 route 6 more times, always during daylight hours. The business loop exit is still there, clearly marked and apparently well maintained. I've seen other trucks use it with no problems. The GPS routes traffic that way regularly, and there's nothing unusual about the road itself, just a standard bypass through what remains of an old mining town. But I haven't taken it, and every night, when I'm lying in bed trying to sleep, I can still hear that voice on the CB radio, speaking its strange language in carefully measured pairs. Sometimes I think I'm starting to understand what the words mean, though I can never quite hold on to the translation once I'm fully awake. I've checked my logbook against the odometer readings from that night, like the passenger suggested. The numbers don't match. According to the truck's computer, I drove 127 miles between Carson City and Reno, but my logbook shows a distance of 89 miles, and the official highway measurement is 112 miles. I can't account for the discrepancy. The map is still in my glove compartment. Sometimes I take it out and study it, trying to understand what those faint symbols around the red cross might mean. They seem to shift slightly when I'm not looking directly at them, like words seen in peripheral vision. And each time I examine the map, the organic smell grows stronger. Last week, I stopped at the Middlegate rest area during a daylight run. I asked the attendant if he'd seen a middle-aged hitchhiker in a baseball cap, someone who might be a regular in the area. He looked at me strangely and said, no one had been hitchhiking from that location in over 5 years. The state patrol had cracked down on it after some incidents. What kind of incidents? I asked. He shrugged. Drivers picking up people who weren't really there. Happens more than you'd think on the night routes. Desert plays tricks on your mind. I've been thinking about that conversation a lot lately. About tricks the mind plays, and about roads that change their moods. About blue cattle grazing on asphalt and voices speaking languages that might not exist. About maps with no names and distances that don't add up. Tonight I'm scheduled to drive US 50 again, and the GPS is already suggesting the Coaldale Business Loop as the optimal route. The mechanical voice sounds almost eager as it calculates the time savings. 14 minutes, it promises. Just 14 minutes. The map is folded in my shirt pocket now. I can feel it against my chest, warm and slightly damp, as if it's alive. And sometimes, late at night when the highway is empty and the only sound is the diesel engine and the wind, I think I can hear that voice again on the CB radio. Vash Kelm Nethro. Vash Kelm Nethro. Calling me back to a road that might not exist, to deliver freight to a destination that has no name. Story 9. The row house stood like a broken tooth in Baltimore's East Side, its brick facade stained with decades of neglect, and the particular kind of decay that seeps into abandoned places like slow poison. Boarded windows created hollow eye sockets, and the front steps sagged under the weight of forgotten years. I'd driven past it countless times, but that October afternoon, something about the way shadows pooled in its doorway made me pull over. Rhett and Vale were already there, setting up their equipment on the cracked sidewalk. We'd been documenting the city's architectural remnants for months, a project born from equal parts artistic ambition and morbid fascination with decay. This house had been empty for 7 years, according to city records, and rumors suggested it contained some of the finest Portuguese tile work from the 1920s. The front door hung loose on corroded hinges, opening with a groan that seemed to echo through the entire structure. Inside, the air tasted of dust and something else, something organic and sour that made my throat tighten. Afternoon light filtered through gaps in the boarding, casting geometric patterns across warped hardwood floors. The tiles were everything we'd hoped for and more. Intricate blue and white patterns covered the kitchen walls, each piece hand-painted with delicate florals and geometric designs. Some had cracked or fallen away entirely, leaving ghostly outlines on the plaster, but enough remained to hint at the room's former elegance. We worked methodically, Rhett adjusting his camera settings while Vale sketched preliminary layouts for our documentation. The house settled around us with the creaks and sighs of old wood adjusting to our presence. I found myself listening to these sounds more intently than usual, cataloging each groan and whisper as if they contained some hidden message. It was while photographing a particularly elaborate tile medallion that we first heard it. The sound started so quietly I almost dismissed it as settling pipes or distant traffic. A thin, high note that seemed to rise from somewhere beneath us, wavering like steam escaping from a kettle. It held for several seconds, faded, then began again, slightly higher this time, with an almost musical quality that made the hair on my arms stand on end. Rhett lowered his camera, head tilted toward the basement door. "You guys hearing that?" The sound continued, now taking on a rhythmic pattern. 3 ascending notes, a pause, then the sequence repeated. It was too regular to be random pipe settling, too purposeful to be accidental. Vale suggested old plumbing, thermal expansion in abandoned radiators. Reasonable explanations that felt hollow even as we voiced them. The basement stairs creaked under our weight as we descended toward the source. Our flashlights carved narrow tunnels through the darkness, illuminating stone walls damp with decades of accumulated moisture. The sound grew clearer down here, definitely coming from within the walls themselves, though I couldn't pinpoint an exact location. Then I noticed the pipes were gone, not just disconnected or capped, completely removed. Phantom connections marked where they'd once been, leaving perfect circular holes in the foundation walls like empty eye sockets. The basement was a skeleton of its former infrastructure, stripped clean years ago by salvagers or the city's utility department. But the sound continued, now taking on an almost conversational quality. 3 notes up, 2 down, a longer tone that seemed to question, then pause for a response that never came. Rhett played his light along the walls, searching for any remaining pipework that might explain what we were hearing. That's when Vale found the dumbwaiter. The opening was hidden behind a section of paneling that had warped away from the wall, revealing a dark shaft that rose into the upper floors. The sound was strongest here, echoing down from somewhere above us with perfect acoustic clarity. I leaned closer to the opening, and the noise stopped so abruptly that the sudden silence felt like a physical blow. We waited, barely breathing, for it to resume. Nothing. The basement held its breath along with us, every shadow seeming to lean closer in anticipation. Then Rhett shifted his weight, and a floorboard creaked above our heads. The sound started again immediately, not from the walls this time, but from directly above us, following our movement with uncanny precision. When we walked to the far corner, it moved with us. When we stood still, it waited. The musical pattern had changed too, becoming more complex, more urgent. 3 ascending notes, 2 descending, then a long, wavering tone that sounded disturbingly like someone trying to catch their breath while crying. We left the house that day with our documentation incomplete and a shared unease that none of us wanted to acknowledge. The drive back to my apartment passed in relative silence, broken only by Vale's half-hearted attempts to rationalize what we'd experienced. Thermal expansion, he insisted. Sound traveling through hidden gaps in the walls. Acoustic tricks that old buildings sometimes play on visitors. But that night, lying in bed, I found myself listening to my own apartment's settling sounds with new attention. Every creak in the walls, every whisper of wind through window frames seemed to carry an echo of that basement melody. When sleep finally came, it brought dreams of empty pipe networks learning to sing. I didn't intend to return to the house. Our project had other locations, other architectural treasures to document. But the sound had embedded itself in my memory like a splinter, working its way deeper with each passing day. I found myself humming the melody unconsciously. 3 notes up, 2 down, that questioning tone at the end. A week later, I drove past the house just to see if the boarding had been replaced, or if the city had finally condemned it entirely. As I slowed near the front steps, I heard it again. Not from inside the house this time, but from somewhere closer. The same melody, the same rhythm, but softer now, more intimate. It seemed to be coming from the row of parked cars along the street, or perhaps from the narrow alley between buildings. I pulled over and rolled down my windows, straining to locate the source. The sound stopped the moment I parked, leaving only the ordinary noise of afternoon traffic and distant construction. I sat there for nearly 20 minutes, waiting, but heard nothing more than the city's usual soundtrack of engines and voices and machinery. That evening, I called the city planning office and asked about the house's history. The records showed it had been abandoned after a basement flood in 2016, but the family had lived there for 3 generations before that. No reports of unusual incidents, no complaints about noise disturbances, just another property casualty of Baltimore's ongoing struggle with urban decay. But the clerk mentioned something else. Renovation permits from 2015 for extensive plumbing work. The entire system had been replaced, old cast iron pipes removed and modernized. The work had been completed just months before the flood that ultimately drove the family out. I found myself thinking about that timing more than seemed reasonable, about pipes that had carried sound and water for nearly a century suddenly being stripped away, leaving empty spaces in the walls, about the acoustic patterns those pipes might have created, the way they might have channeled and amplified the house's daily soundtrack of running water and settling foundations. The second visit happened almost without my conscious decision. I told myself I was checking on equipment we might have left behind, though I knew we'd packed everything carefully. The house looked exactly the same from the outside, but something felt different as I approached the front door. The shadows seemed more deliberate somehow, arranged with purpose rather than falling randomly. Inside, the afternoon light had a different quality, dimmer, more filtered, as if the air itself had thickened in our absence. I made my way directly to the basement, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't quite name. The dumbwaiter opening gaped like a mouth, and as I approached it, the sound began again. But it was different now. The melody was more complex, incorporating new variations I hadn't heard before. And underneath the main theme, I could swear I heard something else. A whispered rhythm that sounded almost like breathing, or perhaps like someone learning to speak by mimicking the cadence of conversation. I pressed my ear to the opening, trying to determine if the sound was traveling down from the upper floors or rising up from some deeper source. The shaft felt warm against my cheek, and for a moment I could have sworn I felt something like breath against my skin. That's when I heard my name. Not spoken clearly, but woven into the melody itself. The syllables stretched and distorted, but unmistakably mine. 3 notes for the first syllable, 2 for the second, held and shaped until they became something more than random sound. The voice, if it was a voice, had the same questioning quality as the original melody, as if trying out the sounds for the first time. I jerked back from the opening so quickly I nearly lost my balance. The sound continued for several more seconds, then faded into silence. But I could feel something listening in that silence, waiting to see what I would do next. The drive home was a blur of anxiety and forced rationality. Audio pareidolia, I told myself. The human tendency to find patterns and meaning in random noise. My brain was simply processing ambiguous sounds and interpreting them as familiar patterns, including my own name. But that night, alone in my apartment, I found myself listening to the walls with growing unease. Every settling sound seemed pregnant with intention. Every whisper of wind through the building's infrastructure felt like communication just beyond my understanding. I started avoiding that part of the city entirely, taking longer routes to anywhere that might require driving past the abandoned row house. But Baltimore is a small city in many ways, and certain streets are unavoidable. 3 weeks after that second visit, I found myself stopped at a traffic light just half a block from the house. The windows were open because my air conditioning was broken, and in the brief moment between traffic signals, I heard it again. The same melody, the same rhythm, but now it was definitely coming from the direction of the house, and woven throughout the musical pattern, clear as daylight, was my name being called in that same questioning tone. But this time, I wasn't alone in hearing it. The elderly man walking his dog on the sidewalk paused and looked toward the house, head tilted as if trying to locate the source of the sound. A woman waiting at the bus stop glanced up from her phone, confusion evident on her face. 2 children playing in a nearby yard stopped their game and stared at the boarded windows. The light changed and traffic resumed its flow, but I could see people continuing to look back over their shoulders as they walked away from the area. Whatever was happening in that house, it was no longer contained within its walls. That evening, I found the courage to call the plumber whose name I'd gotten from a neighbor near the row house. He'd worked on the building's renovation in 2015, he told me, and had lived on the same street for 40 years. When I asked about unusual sounds, his voice took on a careful quality that suggested he'd been asked this question before. The old pipes had been musical, he explained. Cast iron installed in the 1920s with a particular configuration that created acoustic chambers throughout the house. When water ran through them, they'd sing, not unpleasantly, but with a definite melodic quality that the family had grown accustomed to over the generations. When the renovation required complete replacement with modern materials, he'd documented the old system carefully. The acoustics had been part of the house's character, and the family had hoped to preserve some of that musical quality in the new installation. But the flood had ended those plans before the project could be completed. I asked if he'd ever heard anything unusual since the house was abandoned. There was a long pause before he answered, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of something he'd been trying not to think about. Sometimes, he said, when I'm working in other houses on the block, I hear what sounds like someone practicing, like they're trying to get the old songs right, but learning from memory instead of having the actual instruments to work with. He paused again, and I could hear him breathing carefully into the phone. Thing is, the practice is getting better, more accurate, like whatever's doing it is getting closer to recreating the original sound every time. After that conversation, I began paying attention to the sounds in my own apartment building with uncomfortable intensity. Built in the 1940s, it had the same cast iron plumbing that had been standard in Baltimore for decades. When water ran through the pipes, in my unit or anywhere else in the building, there was indeed a musical quality to the sound, and increasingly, those familiar songs seemed to carry echoes of the melody I'd first heard in the basement of the abandoned row house. It started subtly, a phrase here, a rhythmic pattern there, woven into the ordinary sounds of daily life. When my upstairs neighbor ran their shower, I could swear I heard those 3 ascending notes followed by the 2 descending ones. When the building's heating system cycled on, the rushing water seemed to carry that same questioning tone I'd heard echoing through the dumbwaiter shaft. Sleep became elusive. I found myself lying awake, listening to the building's nocturnal symphony, and trying to determine which sounds were normal pipe music and which carried that borrowed melody from the abandoned house. The distinction grew harder to make with each passing night. Then, one Thursday evening in November, my own pipes began to sing my name. It happened while I was washing dishes, the kitchen faucet running at normal pressure. Underneath the steady sound of water against porcelain, I heard those familiar syllables being shaped by moving liquid and acoustic chambers. Not quite right. Still learning, still practicing, but unmistakably my name being called in that same questioning tone. I turned off the faucet immediately, and the sound stopped. But when I turned it back on, there it was again, more confident this time, as if encouraged by my reaction. The voice in the water was getting better at shaping human sounds, more precise in its articulation. I've stopped using running water unless absolutely necessary. Showers are brief and uncomfortable affairs, dishes pile up in the sink, and I've taken to drinking from bottles I buy outside the neighborhood. But the practice continues around me, in the apartments above and below, in the houses I pass on the street. The abandoned row house is still there, still boarded and empty according to official records, but sometimes, walking past it in the evening, I can see light moving behind the boards. Not electric light, but something that flickers and flows like water catching illumination from some hidden source. And the sound has evolved beyond simple melody now. Walking past last week, I heard what could only be described as conversation. Multiple voices in the walls, practicing different names, different syllables, as if building a vocabulary from the acoustic memories embedded in the city's plumbing. I've been considering moving to a newer building, something with modern plastic pipes that don't carry sound the same way. But I'm beginning to suspect it wouldn't matter. The practice has spread beyond that single house, beyond that specific network of cast iron chambers. Whatever learned to sing in those walls has found other instruments to play, other venues for its rehearsals. Tonight, lying in bed, I listen to my building's evening symphony and try to identify which sounds are ordinary pipe music and which are something else entirely. The distinction grows more difficult each night, as if the difference between natural and learned is becoming meaningless. From somewhere in the walls, carried by moving water and acoustic chambers that were never meant to carry voices, I hear my name being called with increasing confidence and clarity, and I'm beginning to recognize other names in the melody as well. Neighbors, friends, strangers whose syllables are being collected and practiced and perfected by something that has learned to speak, by listening to the songs that water makes in aging pipes. The rehearsal continues, and the performance grows closer to opening night. Story 10. The first thing you need to understand is that I wasn't looking for anything supernatural when I drove to that abandoned hospital in Dayton. I was documenting decay, nothing more. Urban exploration had become my weekend ritual, a way to escape the suffocating routine of my accounting job and the empty apartment that still smelled faintly of her perfume 3 months after she'd left. The Riverside Medical Center had been shuttered since 2019, its windows boarded with plywood that bore spray-painted warnings about trespassing and structural instability. But like most urban explorers, I'd learned that hospitals were rarely as empty as they appeared. The basement levels, particularly the old civil defense shelters from the Cold War era, often remained accessible through forgotten service entrances. I found mine behind a rusted dumpster, where a maintenance door hung askew on corroded hinges. The lock had long since surrendered to Ohio's brutal winters and scalding summers, leaving the entrance gaping like a mouth frozen mid-scream. The August heat outside was murderous. 93 degrees with humidity that made the air feel liquid. I'd packed my Instax camera, a flashlight, and, on what I thought was paranoid impulse, a Geiger counter I'd bought online after reading too many articles about medical waste contamination. The device hung from my belt like a digital talisman, its faint electronic chirping providing an oddly comforting rhythm as I descended into the hospital's bowels. The stairs were concrete, their edges worn smooth by decades of foot traffic. Emergency lighting strips glowed a sickly amber, powered by some generator that had outlived the hospital itself. The walls were institutional green, that particular shade that existed only in government buildings and medical facilities, as if someone had distilled the essence of bureaucratic despair into paint. 3 flights down, I reached the shelter level. The corridor stretched in both directions, lined with doors bearing faded civil defense symbols, those stark triangles within circles that had once promised salvation from atomic fire. Most rooms were empty, their contents long since stripped by scavengers or removed by the city. But the air here felt different, heavier. It carried a metallic taste that coated my tongue and made my teeth ache. The cold hit me when I opened the 7th door. Not the pleasant coolness of air conditioning, but something sharper, more aggressive. It was as if I'd stepped into a meat locker, though my breath didn't fog immediately. The room was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with white tile walls that reflected my flashlight beam in a way that made the space seem to pulse. In the center sat a single chair, leather restraints hanging loose from its arms like dead snakes. I raised the Instax, framing the chair against the wall of tiles. The camera's mechanical click echoed strangely in the confined space, seeming to bounce back from directions that didn't match the room's geometry. When the photo emerged, I tucked it into my jacket pocket without looking at it. The Instax took time to develop, and I'd learned patience in my months of exploration. The metal ceiling was sweating. Not condensation from temperature change, but actual beads of water that caught my flashlight and threw it back in needle-sharp points of light. Each droplet that hit the floor created a sound like a distant bell, creating a crystalline percussion that seemed to follow no discernible pattern. I took 3 more photos in rapid succession, documenting the restraint chair from different angles. The Geiger counter remained mercifully silent, just its normal background chirping, no increase in radiation. Whatever had happened in this room, it wasn't nuclear. When I finally looked at the first photograph, my hands began to shake. The image showed the chair and the tiled wall clearly enough, but scattered across the picture were white specks, like snow. Not the normal artifacts of instant photography, but something else. Something that looked almost intentional, as if someone had thrown handfuls of powder in front of the lens, just as I'd pressed the shutter. The other photos showed the same thing. White flakes, some large enough to see individual crystalline structures, others just pinpricks of light against the dark background. But I hadn't seen any snow in that room. I'd seen ice on the metal, yes, but nothing falling. I pocketed the photos and headed for the exit. The cold had seeped through my jacket and shirt, settling against my skin like a living thing. My joints ached with a deep chill that seemed to radiate from my bones outward, as if I'd been refrigerated from the inside. The climb back to ground level felt longer than the descent. Each flight of stairs seemed to add weight to my legs, and by the time I reached the maintenance door, I was breathing hard despite the relatively easy climb. But that's when I noticed it. My breath was visible. Dense white vapor poured from my mouth and nose with each exhalation, despite the fact that I was standing in 90-degree heat. I stumbled outside, expecting the phenomenon to stop immediately. Instead, it persisted. I stood there in the blazing August sun, watching my breath fog in the air like I was standing in a winter storm. A group of photographers I'd seen earlier were loading equipment into their van nearby. One of them glanced my way and waved, his expression puzzled, but not alarmed. He couldn't see what I was seeing. The drive home passed in a blur of confused concentration. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that hospital receding in the distance like some nightmare that refused to end. But it stayed exactly where it should have been, just another abandoned building in a city full of them. It wasn't until I was standing in my bathroom running hot water over my hands that I realized my shirt was soaked through, not with sweat, I hadn't been warm enough to sweat, but with something else. The fabric was damp and cold to the touch, as if I'd spent hours in a walk-in freezer instead of 20 minutes in a basement room. I changed clothes and made coffee, but the warmth wouldn't take hold. The chill seemed to have settled in my chest, spreading outward with each heartbeat. I wrapped myself in blankets and cranked the thermostat to 85, but nothing helped. That night, the dreams began. I was back in the room with the restraint chair, but this time I wasn't alone. Figures stood in the corners, not quite human, not quite shadow. They didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel their attention like physical weight pressing against my skin. The chair creaked slightly, as if someone invisible was testing its strength. The metal ceiling continued to weep, each drop now falling with the precision of a metronome. And it was snowing. Actually snowing, with flakes the size of quarters drifting down from nowhere, accumulating on the chair's leather arms and the tiled floor. But when I tried to catch one, my hand passed through it like vapor. I woke shivering in my 85-degree apartment, my breath visible in the darkness. The next day brought no relief. The cold had taken permanent residence in my bones, and no amount of heat seemed capable of evicting it. Worse, I'd begun to notice things. Subtle things, the way shadows seemed to linger a fraction too long after I'd passed. The way my coffee stayed hot on one side of the cup, but went cold on the other. The way my reflection in mirrors appeared slightly delayed, as if it was struggling to keep up with my movements. I returned to work on Monday, hoping the routine would restore some sense of normalcy, but my colleagues kept commenting on the temperature in my office. The facilities manager came by twice to check the thermostat, insisting that the building's systems were functioning normally. Yet anyone who spent more than a few minutes in my presence began reaching for sweaters. By Wednesday, I'd decided to return to the hospital. I needed to understand what had happened in that room, to find some rational explanation for the photographs and the persistent cold that followed me like a faithful dog. This time, I brought better equipment: a digital camera with infrared capability, a thermometer, and a voice recorder. If something was happening to me, I would document it properly. The basement felt different during my second visit. The corridors seemed longer, the amber emergency lighting dimmer. The smell of metal and decay was stronger, almost overwhelming. But I pressed forward, counting doors until I reached the seventh. The room was exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing. The chair had moved. Not dramatically, just a few inches clockwise, as if someone had been sitting in it and had shifted their weight before standing. But I knew I hadn't touched it during my first visit. I was certain of that. I set up my equipment methodically, taking readings and photographs from every angle. The digital camera showed normal room temperature everywhere, except near the chair, where the infrared readings dropped by nearly 30 degrees. The thermometer confirmed it. The air around that piece of furniture was cold enough to see your breath, which explained the visible vapor in my original photos, but it didn't explain the snow. I loaded a fresh cartridge into the Instax and began shooting again. This time I watched carefully as each photo developed. The white flakes appeared gradually, as if materializing from within the emulsion itself. They weren't artifacts of the development process. They were part of the image, captured at the moment of exposure. I was studying the latest photograph when I heard the sound. A sigh. Soft, almost inaudible, but unmistakably human. It seemed to come from the chair itself, as if someone invisible was settling into its embrace. The leather restraints shifted slightly, creaking with the phantom weight. My voice recorder was running. I checked the playback immediately, rewinding to the moment I'd heard the sigh. The device had captured everything. My footsteps, my breathing, the ambient sounds of the building. But no sigh, no creak of leather, nothing. I was the only one who could hear it. The revelation hit me like cold water. Whatever was happening wasn't happening to the room. It was happening to me. The hospital hadn't given me something supernatural. It had awakened something that was already there. Some sensitivity, some doorway in my perception that had been cracked open by exposure to that freezing room. I gathered my equipment and left, But this time I knew I was taking something with me. Something that would make the cold permanent, make the shadows linger, make my reflection lag behind my movements. I was becoming a conduit for whatever lived in that space, a walking extension of its impossible geometry. Driving home, I caught myself checking the rearview mirror obsessively, not looking for pursuit, but searching for proof that I was still solid, still real. Because the alternative, that I was slowly becoming like whatever haunted that room, was too terrible to accept. Yet acceptance seemed inevitable. Each day the cold grew stronger, grew. Each night, the dreams became more vivid. And each morning, I woke up a little less certain about which side of the mirror I was supposed to be on. The photographs I'd taken were still in my jacket pocket. I pulled them out that evening, spreading them across my kitchen table under the harsh fluorescent light. The white flakes were more numerous in each subsequent image, as if whatever was creating them was gaining strength from my repeated visits. But there was something else, something I hadn't noticed before. In the background of the last photo, barely visible behind the swirling white specks, was a figure, not clear enough to make out features, but definitely humanoid. And it was sitting in the restraint chair, watching the camera with what might have been patient interest. I held the photograph closer to the light, squinting at the unclear shape. The longer I stared, the more details seemed to emerge from the grain. A face, pale and indistinct, hands resting casually on the chair's arms, and eyes, dark holes that seemed to look directly at me through the chemical emulsion, as if the image was a window rather than a photograph. The temperature in my kitchen dropped 10 degrees in as many seconds. I set the photograph down with shaking hands, but I couldn't look away from it. The figure in the chair seemed more solid now, more present. And I had the disturbing feeling that the longer I stared, the more real it was becoming. Not just in the photograph, but here, in my kitchen, sitting invisibly in the chair across from me. My breath began to fog again. The fluorescent light flickered once, twice, then steadied. But in those brief moments of darkness, I could have sworn I heard the soft whisper of leather against skin, as if someone was adjusting their position in an old chair. I've been sitting here for 3 hours now, afraid to look up from this page, afraid to confirm what I already know. The cold isn't just following me anymore, it's spreading, taking over, making my apartment into another version of that basement room, complete with its patient, invisible occupant. The question isn't whether any of this is real. The question is whether I'm still real enough to care about the distinction. Because each breath I take creates a little more fog, and each time I blink, the shadows seem to shift just slightly out of true. I can hear the leather creaking now, soft and rhythmic, like someone breathing, but I'm the only one here. Story 11. The water never stops moving here. Even when the canal looks still from my deck, I can hear it. A constant whisper against the seawall, like something trying to speak just below the threshold of understanding. I bought this place 6 months ago because I needed the isolation, needed somewhere the city couldn't follow me with its noise and demands. The real estate agent mentioned the occasional flooding during king tides, but she didn't mention how the water seems to watch you. That first night changed everything. I'd been sleeping poorly since the move, my body still adjusting to the rhythm of tides and the unfamiliar sounds of a house built on water. The security system helped somewhat. Motion sensors, door alarms, cameras. But you can't secure yourself against the feeling that something's always just outside your peripheral vision. It was past 3 in the morning when I heard them. Footsteps on the deck. Not the quick patter of a raccoon or the scurrying of crabs, but deliberate, measured steps. Wet steps. Each footfall made a distinct squelch against the composite decking, like someone walking in waterlogged boots. I lay frozen in bed, listening to the sound move slowly along the length of the deck toward the sliding glass door that led into my living room. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door, and then I heard it. A faint metallic tinkling, rhythmic and careful. Someone was tampering with the door sensor. My phone showed the security app. Door sensor still active. No breach detected. but I could hear that soft, persistent tinking of metal against metal, like someone was using a thin rod to probe around the magnetic contact without triggering it. I crept to the window and peered through the blinds. The deck was empty, but I could see wet footprints, large human footprints that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. They led from the edge of the deck, where someone would have climbed up from the water, straight to my door. That's when I hit the motion sprinkler system. The sudden spray of water was followed immediately by a muffled curse. Definitely human, definitely male, and then silence. I watched through the blinds as the sprinkler continued its cycle, but saw no one running away. The footprints remained, growing fainter as the water diluted them, until only dark, irregular stains marked where someone had been standing. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. Morning brought worse mysteries. The wet handprints on the glass door weren't what you'd expect from someone trying to break in. Instead of normal palm prints or fingerprints, these marks formed a strange spiral pattern, as if whoever had touched the glass had rolled their entire hand around some central point, leaving a swirling imprint that looked almost intentional, almost artistic. But it was the algae that really unsettled me. Fine, hair-like strands of green vegetation had somehow gotten into the door track, not just a few pieces, but enough to create a thin carpet along the entire length of the sliding mechanism. I'd lived on water before. I knew algae didn't just migrate inland like that, especially not during low tide. I called the police, showed them the prints and the tracks, but their report was predictably unhelpful. Probable attempted burglary, they said. The spiral handprints were unusual, but not necessarily significant. People did strange things when they were high or desperate. The algae could have been tracked in by the perpetrator if they'd been waiting in the canal. Their explanation was reasonable, logical even, but it didn't account for what happened next. The visits became regular. Not every night, but often enough that I started staying awake, listening. Always the same pattern. Wet footsteps moving slowly across the deck, stopping at the door, followed by that careful, methodical tinking as someone, or something, probed the sensor. I upgraded the security system twice, adding cameras with night vision and motion detection, but they never captured anything during these incidents. The audio picked up the footsteps clearly enough, but the visual feed showed only an empty deck. The handprints appeared more frequently too, always in that same spiral pattern, always on the glass door. I'd clean them off in the morning, but by the next evening, they'd be back. Sometimes I found them on other windows too. My bedroom window, the kitchen window that faced the canal. Always spirals, always at exactly the height where someone standing on the deck would naturally place their hand. I started researching the house's history, diving into property records and newspaper archives. The previous owner had sold the place after living here for only 8 months. Before that, it had sat empty for 2 years following a foreclosure. The original owner, an elderly man whose name was redacted in most of the records I could access, had lived here for nearly 15 years before. What? The records were frustratingly vague. The more I dug, the more questions arose. Several neighbors mentioned seeing lights in the house during the 2 years it supposedly sat empty. The county had no record of anyone maintaining the property during that time, yet the landscaping had remained mysteriously pristine. Most unsettling were the casual mentions of someone seen walking the deck at night, even when no one was supposed to be living there. One afternoon, while cleaning the latest spiral handprint from my door, I noticed something that made my blood go cold. Inside the spiral pattern, barely visible unless the light hit it just right, were what looked like fingerprints. But they weren't human fingerprints. The whorls and ridges were too long, too thin, with a pattern that seemed to curve in impossible directions. That night, I decided to confront whatever was happening. I set up a chair facing the sliding door and waited, camera in hand, determined to document whatever came calling. The moon was full, casting everything in sharp silver relief. The canal was unusually still, its surface like black glass reflecting the sky. The footsteps began just after midnight. This time, I could see them forming on the deck, not the person making them, but the wet impressions appearing one after another, as if invisible feet were walking across the wood. Each step left a clear mark that glistened in the moonlight, moving in that same deliberate path from the edge of the deck to my door. The tinking started immediately, but now I could see what was causing it. A thin piece of what looked like driftwood, about the length of a pencil, was floating in midair next to the door sensor, tapping rhythmically against the metal housing. As I watched, frozen with a mixture of terror and fascination, the piece of wood began to probe more carefully, sliding along the sensor's edges with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. I raised my camera, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. Through the viewfinder, I saw something that made me doubt my own eyes. For just a moment, in the space where the footprints were appearing, I caught a glimpse of what might have been a figure. Tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed to bend in too many places. But when I lowered the camera, there was nothing there. The door sensor gave a soft chirp, indicating it had been successfully bypassed. The sliding door began to open. I found myself paralyzed, watching as the heavy glass panel moved slowly aside with barely a whisper of sound. The opening grew wider, 6 inches, a foot, 18 inches. Wide enough for someone to slip through sideways. The wet footprints continued into my house. They moved across the tile floor of the living room, leaving small puddles that reflected the moonlight streaming through the windows. I could track their progress by the sound. Not just footsteps now, but a kind of soft, sliding noise, as if whatever was making them was dragging something behind it. The smell hit me then. Brine and decay, like low tide mixed with something that had been underwater too long. It grew stronger as the invisible presence moved deeper into the house, and I realized it was heading toward the hallway that led to my bedroom. I managed to force myself to move, stumbling backward off the chair and fumbling for the light switch. The sudden flood of artificial light revealed my living room exactly as I'd left it, except for the wet trail leading from the door to the hallway. As I watched, more water seemed to be seeping from somewhere, pooling on the floor in irregular shapes that reminded me disturbingly of those spiral handprints. I called out, my voice cracking with fear. "Who's there? What do you want?" The sliding sound stopped immediately, but the smell grew stronger. Then, slowly, more wet handprints began appearing on the wall beside the hallway entrance. These were different from the ones on the windows, larger, with fingers that seemed too long, and they were forming in real time as I watched. One hand, then another, as if something was feeling its way along the wall. The prints moved higher on the wall than any normal person could reach. I grabbed my phone and called 911, but even as I spoke to the dispatcher, I knew how insane I sounded. An invisible intruder leaving wet footprints and impossible handprints. Security footage that showed nothing despite clear audio evidence. Even I was starting to wonder if I was losing my mind. The police arrived within 10 minutes, but by then the water had evaporated and the prints had faded to barely visible stains. The officers were professional but skeptical, especially when I showed them the security footage from my cameras. The audio was there. Footsteps, the tinking, even my own voice calling out. But the video showed nothing but an empty house. One officer suggested I might want to consider seeing a doctor, mentioning stress and sleep deprivation as possible causes for what I was experiencing. The other officer was more direct, asking about my alcohol consumption and whether I was taking any medications. After they left, I stood in my living room trying to convince myself they were right. Stress, isolation, the adjustment to living on water, it all made sense as an explanation for what had to be hallucinations. But as I was turning off the lights, I noticed something that made my rational explanations crumble. The algae was back in the door track, but this time it formed a pattern. Thin green strands arranged in the same spiral design as the handprints, as if something had deliberately placed them there while I was talking to the police. I haven't slept in my house for the past 3 weeks. I've been staying at a motel on the mainland, driving back each day to check on things and maintain some semblance of normalcy. But the signs are always there when I return. New handprints, more algae, and sometimes wet areas on the floor that form shapes I don't want to think about too carefully. Yesterday, I found something that finally broke my resolve to keep living here. In my bedroom, on the wall above my bed, someone, or something, had arranged hundreds of pieces of algae into a massive spiral that covered nearly the entire wall. It was beautiful in a way that made my skin crawl, intricate and purposeful, like a message written in a language I couldn't understand but somehow recognized. But it wasn't just the algae that drove me away. It was what I found underneath it. When I tried to clean off the arrangement, I discovered that it had been placed over indentations in the wall, spiral-shaped depressions that looked like they'd been worn into the plaster by years of something repeatedly tracing the same pattern. The indentations went deep, down to the wooden framework behind the drywall, and they were old. Much older than the 6 months I'd been living there. I'm writing this from my motel room, trying to decide what to do next. The rational part of my mind keeps insisting there has to be an explanation, some kind of elaborate prank, or a gradual psychological breakdown brought on by isolation and stress. But I can't shake the feeling that something has been living in that house much longer than I have. Something that considers my presence an intrusion. The real estate agent called this morning to ask how I was settling in. When I mentioned the algae and the handprints, there was a long pause before she asked if I'd noticed anything else unusual. Her tone suggested she was expecting this call. I asked her about the previous owner, the one who'd only stayed 8 months. She was reluctant to say much, but eventually admitted he'd complained about similar incidents before abruptly moving out. When I pressed for details about the original owner, she became even more evasive, mentioning only that he'd become very reclusive toward the end, and that the house had some unique characteristics that weren't fully disclosed during my purchase. Tonight I'm going back to the house one last time. Not to stay, but to pack my essential belongings and arrange for movers to handle the rest. I can't live there anymore, but I also can't stop thinking about those spiral depressions in the bedroom wall, about how old they looked, about what could have made them. As I sit here writing, I keep touching my own palm, tracing circles on the skin, and wondering if it's possible for something to change you without you realizing it. My fingers seem to move in those spiral patterns now without conscious thought. And sometimes I catch myself arranging objects on tables in the same circular designs I've been finding throughout the house. Maybe the thing that's been visiting me isn't trying to break in at all. Maybe it's been trying to get out. The water never stops moving here, and neither do the things that live beneath it. I understand that now. I just hope I'm not too late to understand what I might be taking with me when I leave. Story 12. The high desert of New Mexico stretches like a fever dream under the October sun, all rust-colored mesas and shadows that seem to move when you're not looking directly at them. We'd been planning this traverse for months, 3 days between the ravines, following an old geological survey route that most hikers avoided due to the lack of reliable water sources. That's why we'd spent the previous weekend caching supplies, burying gallon jugs wrapped in reflective emergency blankets at carefully mapped coordinates. The biological soil crust crunched beneath our boots as we made our way toward the first ravine, a sound like walking on burnt toast mixed with bubble wrap. The stuff was everywhere out here, a living carpet of cyanobacteria, lichens and mosses that could take decades to recover from a single footstep. Every step left a perfect impression, a fossil of our passage that would remain visible for years. We'd started before dawn, headlamps cutting weak cones through the pre-morning darkness. The silence was absolute except for the whisper of our synthetic clothing and the rhythmic compression of sand beneath our feet. No birds, no insects, no wind. Just the four of us moving through a landscape that felt more like the surface of some distant planet than anywhere on Earth. The sun crested the eastern rim just as we reached our first rest stop, and that's when we saw him. He emerged from behind a cluster of barrel cacti about 50 yards ahead, moving with the unhurried gait of someone completely at home in this harsh environment. Park Service uniform, though it looked like something from decades past, the green fabric faded to a peculiar gray-brown, the cut loose and practical in a way that modern uniforms weren't. Wide-brimmed hat casting his face in shadow. "Morning," he called out, his voice carrying strangely in the thin air. "Saw your fire from the ridge. Nice work keeping it contained." We hadn't built a fire. We'd been moving in darkness, covering ground while the air was still cool. I glanced at my companions, saw the same confusion reflected in their faces, but there, where we'd stopped to adjust our packs 20 minutes earlier, was a neat ring of stones with gray ash in the center. The rocks were still warm to the touch. The ranger approached our improvised fire circle, knelt down, and picked up a piece of charred wood that hadn't been there before. The moment his fingers made contact, the wood hissed, Not the sharp crack of dry timber, but a long, sustained whisper like steam escaping from a pressure valve. Vapor rose from where he touched it, though the morning air was bone dry. "Creosote burns clean," he said, turning the smoldering branch in his hands. "Burns long, too. Desert folk have known that for centuries." I wanted to ask him about the fire, about how it had appeared, about who had built it. But something in his manner, the casual way he handled the impossible, made the question stick in my throat. Instead, I found myself nodding along as he talked about proper wilderness etiquette, about leaving no trace, about respecting the delicate ecosystem we were walking through. When I finally worked up the courage to look away from his weathered hands and ask his name, he was gone. No movement. No sound of departure. Just empty desert where he'd been standing moments before. I immediately looked down at the biological crust around the fire ring. Our footprints were there, sharp and clear in the morning light. 4 sets of modern hiking boots, treads mapped perfectly in the fragile surface. But where the ranger had walked, where he'd knelt, where he'd stood while talking to us, there was nothing. The crust was undisturbed, unbroken, as pristine as if no human foot had ever touched it. "Did you see?" one of my companions started to ask, but I held up a hand. We all knew what we'd seen. We all knew what we hadn't seen. Talking about it wouldn't make it make sense. We continued hiking. The day grew hotter as we descended toward the main ravine system. The air shimmered with thermals, creating phantom lakes on distant flats and making the horizon dance like water. Every shadow could have hidden a figure. Every rock formation looked like it might move when we weren't watching. The silence began to feel oppressive rather than peaceful. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something waiting. By noon, the temperature had climbed past 90 degrees. We'd been rationing water carefully, but the heat was relentless. My shirt clung to my back, salt stains blooming across the fabric in abstract patterns. The straps of my pack felt like they were cutting grooves into my shoulders. That's when the weather changed. It started as a darkening on the northwestern horizon, clouds building with unnatural speed. Within minutes, the sky directly overhead had turned the color of old pewter, pregnant with moisture that had no business existing in this arid landscape. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds. The first drops were warm, blood warm, and they fell with the weight of mercury. Each impact on the rocky ground rang like a small bell, but as the shower intensified, something strange began to happen. The water hitting the heated stone didn't pool or run off. Instead, it formed a thin film that immediately began to crystallize, creating a surface like obsidian glass over everything. Within minutes, every flat surface was covered with this bizarre ice-glass hybrid. The depressions and natural basins filled with water underneath, creating pools with mirror-smooth tops and liquid darkness beneath. When I knelt to examine one of these formations, my reflection stared back from what looked like a sheet of black ice, but my breath didn't fog the surface, and the strange material was neither cold nor warm to the touch. The rain stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving us standing in a landscape transformed. The world gleamed like it had been dipped in liquid mercury. Our footprints behind us were preserved under the glass coating, but ahead, the trail disappeared into this crystalline maze. We found shelter in a concrete culvert that crossed beneath what had once been a road, though the asphalt was long gone, and only the drainage remained. The structure was about 6 feet in diameter, large enough for us to sit comfortably while we waited for the strange weather to pass. Our voices echoed strangely in the confined space, taking on harmonics that made even ordinary conversation sound ominous. That's when we turned on the NOAA weather radio. The broadcast was exactly what you'd expect. Current conditions, extended forecast, wind speeds, and barometric pressure. But underneath the meteorologist's professional monotone, barely audible but definitely present, were whispers. Not static, not interference from distant stations. Whispers, human voices speaking words just below the threshold of comprehension. We huddled around the small device, straining to understand what the voices were saying. The official forecast played on repeat. Unseasonably warm temperatures, clear skies, no precipitation expected for the next 72 hours. while the whispers provided a constant counterpoint, rising and falling like a conversation in an adjacent room. Every few minutes, the broadcast would hiccup, repeat a phrase, or jump backward to something that had been said earlier. And during these glitches, the whispers would become momentarily clearer, almost intelligible, before fading back into the susurrus of subliminal sound. One of my companions suggested we check our fingers and ears for signs of hypothermia, a reasonable precaution given the rapid temperature change. We went through the routine motions, examining each other's extremities for the telltale white patches of frostbite. But even as we warmed our hands against each other's bodies, even as we confirmed that everyone was fine, the ritual felt wrong, like we were following a script written by someone else, performing actions that belonged to a different story entirely. The whispers on the radio seemed to approve of our caution. By late afternoon, the strange glass coating had begun to sublimate, releasing wisps of vapor that rose from every surface like smoke. The landscape slowly returned to its normal desert appearance, but something fundamental had changed. The light was different. Not dimmer exactly, but as if it were coming from a slightly different angle than it should have been. Shadows fell in directions that didn't quite match the position of the sun. We resumed our hike, following compass bearings toward our planned exit point. But with each step, the feeling of wrongness grew stronger. The terrain looked familiar yet alien, like photographs of a place you'd visited in a dream. Rock formations that should have been on our left appeared on our right. Distant landmarks seemed closer than they had been that morning, while others had vanished entirely. The biological soil crust told its own disturbing story. Our morning tracks were there, perfectly preserved, but they seemed to lead in directions we hadn't traveled. In some places, our footprints appeared to circle back on themselves, creating patterns that defied memory and logic. In others, the tracks simply ended, as if we'd walked to a certain point and then been lifted into the air. As the sun began its descent toward the western mesas, casting the landscape in shades of gold and rust, we crested the final ridge before our exit point. Below us should have been the trailhead parking area, the reassuring sight of our vehicle, and the familiar brown sign marking the entrance to the recreation area. The sign was there, but it was facing the wrong direction. The wooden posts were exactly where they should have been, the bronze plaque exactly the right size and color. But the text, "Welcome to Bandelier National Monument," faced back toward the wilderness we'd just emerged from, as if welcoming visitors to enter a place we'd supposedly been leaving. I approached the sign slowly, my companions hanging back as if proximity to this impossible object might be dangerous. The mounting hardware showed no signs of having been recently moved. The posts were weathered and stable, clearly having stood in their current position for years. But the orientation was absolutely, unquestionably wrong. We'd entered the wilderness from this exact spot 3 days earlier. We'd posed for photographs in front of the sign, the welcoming message clearly visible behind our smiling faces. I had those photos on my phone, timestamps and GPS coordinates confirming our location and the time of our departure. But now the sign proclaimed that the wilderness lay ahead of us, that civilization was somewhere behind us in the trackless desert we'd just traversed. I walked around to what should have been the back of the sign, expecting to find blank wood, or perhaps some maintenance information. Instead, there was another bronze plaque, identical to the first, also facing away from the parking area. No matter which direction I approached from, the sign insisted that I was entering the wilderness, not leaving it. The parking area was empty except for our vehicle, exactly where we'd left it. The keys were in my pocket, the doors unlocked. Everything was normal except for the fundamental wrongness of our location, the impossible geometry of a sign that welcomed visitors to a place we'd never been while turning its back on the place we'd come from. As we loaded our packs into the vehicle, the No AA radio crackled to life one final time. The same forecast, the same professional voice, the same whispered undertones. But now I could almost understand what the whispers were saying, and I realized they weren't speaking English. They weren't speaking any language I'd ever heard. We drove away in silence, the backward sign receding in our mirrors. But even now, weeks later, I find myself questioning the sequence of events. Did we really hike for 3 days? Or had we somehow circled back to our starting point? Was the ranger real? Or had the isolation and heat played tricks on our collective perception? Had the weather actually turned impossible, or had we misremembered, misinterpreted, misunderstood? The photographs on my phone tell a consistent story. 4 friends on a hiking trip, timestamps progressing normally over 3 days. But the metadata shows GPS coordinates that place us at our starting point for the entire duration of the trip. According to the digital record, we never moved at all. Sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I turn on the NOAA weather radio and listen to the forecasts. The voices are always professional, always clear, always accurate. But if I listen carefully, if I really strain to hear what's underneath the official words, I can still make out the whispers. And sometimes, just sometimes, they sound like they're calling my name. The biological soil crust in that part of New Mexico takes decades to form, centuries to mature. Every footstep leaves a mark that will outlast the person who made it. Somewhere out there in the high desert, our tracks are still visible, following paths we don't remember walking, leading to places we never intended to go. The sign still stands at the entrance to the recreation area, welcoming visitors with its bronze plaque and weathered posts. I've checked online satellite images, compared current photos with archived versions, even called the Park Service to ask about recent maintenance. According to every official record, the sign has never been moved, never been rotated, never been altered in any way. It has always faced the direction it faces now, which means either the entire world has shifted around it, or we never left at all. Story 13. The cannery whistle cut through the Alaskan morning like a rusted blade, and I knew my 3-month stint in this forgotten corner of the world was finally wearing me down to nothing. The village, if you could call a cluster of weathered buildings clinging to the coastline a village, had no name on any map I'd seen, just a dot where the processing plant squatted like a metal tumor against the endless gray of sea and sky. I'd come here for the money, same as everyone else. Seasonal work that paid enough to dig me out of debt and maybe leave something extra. The kind of job that asked no questions about your past and expected you to ask none about the place. But after 10 weeks of gutting fish under fluorescent lights that hummed like angry wasps, I was beginning to understand why the turnover rate was so high. The thrift store sat at the edge of town, wedged between a defunct gas station and a building that might have once been a church. I'd passed it dozens of times on my walks to clear the stench of salmon from my lungs, but never ventured inside until that particular Saturday when the fog rolled in thick enough to swallow sounds. The owner was an ancient woman whose skin looked like tanned leather left too long in the sun. She watched me from behind the counter with eyes the color of sea ice, never speaking as I browsed through the random detritus of lives abandoned or forgotten. Most of it was junk. Rusted fishing gear, moldy books, clothes that smelled of tobacco and loneliness. That's when I found it. The walrus tusk sat on a shelf between a broken compass and a collection of yellowed postcards. It was about 8 inches long, curved like a scimitar, with intricate carvings spiraling around its surface. The etching was unmistakably native work, the kind of scrimshaw that told stories in flowing lines and symbols that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. $25. Cash only. The old woman's fingers brushed mine when she handed me the change, and they were cold as seawater. She said something under her breath in a language I didn't recognize, then turned away before I could ask her to repeat it. I carried the tusk back to my rented room above the company store, feeling oddly pleased with the purchase. It had weight to it, substance, something real and permanent in a place that felt increasingly unmoored from the world I knew. That first night, I placed it on the windowsill where the weak light from the harbor could catch the carved surface. The intricate patterns seemed to flow in the amber glow from the processing plant's security lights, and I found myself staring at it longer than I should have, trying to decipher the story it told. Sleep came hard and shallow, interrupted by dreams of gray water and voices speaking in tongues I almost understood. I woke to the sound of singing. It was low and rhythmic, drifting through the thin walls like fog through fishing nets. At first I thought it was the radio from the room next door, but as I lay there listening, I realized it wasn't coming from inside the building at all. The melody seemed to rise from the direction of the docks, a guttural harmony that reminded me of throat singing I'd heard in documentaries about Arctic peoples. I checked my watch. 3:17 a.m. The singing continued for perhaps 10 minutes, then faded until I couldn't be sure I'd heard it at all. When I finally drifted back to sleep, my last conscious thought was how the carved tusk seemed to gleam brighter in the darkness. The next evening brought the fog in thick and early, wrapping the village in a gray shroud that muffled sound and distorted distance. I was walking back from the diner when I noticed something moving near the dumpster behind the cannery. At first glance, it looked like a pale, elongated seal, but seals don't rear up on their hind flippers and move with such deliberate purpose. This thing was nearly 4 feet tall when it stood, with a body too thin for its length and a tail that extended far beyond what nature intended. It moved with fluid grace between the wooden pallets stacked behind the building, its pale skin almost luminescent in the dim light. I blinked, and it was gone. The logical part of my brain, the part that had gotten me through 4 years of college and into a respectable job I'd promptly lost, insisted I'd seen an otter. River otters were common here, and the fog could play tricks with perspective and proportion. But otters don't move like that, don't carry themselves with such unsettling intelligence. When I reached my room, the walrus tusk was no longer on the windowsill. I found it an hour later, after tearing apart the small space in growing panic. It was jammed toe first into my left work boot, sea salt crystals clinging to the carved surface like barnacles. The salt was dry and ancient-looking, nothing like the damp spray that hung in the air constantly. I tried to convince myself I'd moved it and forgotten. Stress did things to memory, made you do things without conscious thought. But even as I told myself this, I knew it was a lie. I remembered placing it on the sill before leaving for dinner. I remembered the way the carving caught the light. The singing returned that night, closer now and more distinct. It wasn't the random vocalization of drunken fishermen or the static from someone's radio. This was deliberate, ceremonial, the kind of chanting that belonged in sacred spaces or forgotten rituals. I pressed my face to the window, trying to locate the source. The fog had thickened until the harbor lights looked like smeared watercolors, but I could make out shapes moving on the docks. Dark figures that seemed to sway in rhythm with the low harmonies drifting through the night air. By morning, the fog had lifted, and the docks were empty except for the usual collection of boats and gear. I asked the plant foreman if there had been any kind of ceremony or gathering the night before. He looked at me like I'd asked if he'd seen any unicorns lately, and suggested I was working too many double shifts. The tusk disappeared twice more over the next week, each time turning up in increasingly strange locations. Once I found it buried in the bag of dirty laundry at the foot of my bed, wrapped in a sock that reeked of brine and decay. Another time it was balanced precariously on the edge of the sink, positioned so that water from the leaky faucet would drip steadily onto the carved surface. Each discovery left me more unsettled, not just because of the impossible relocations, but because of how the tusk felt when I touched it. The ivory was always cold, far colder than the ambient temperature of the room, and sometimes I could swear I felt a faint vibration running through it, like a tuning fork struck far below the range of human hearing. The dreams grew more vivid and specific. I found myself standing waist-deep in dark water that stretched to every horizon, while voices called to me from depths I couldn't fathom. The carved symbols from the tusk would float past my vision like jellyfish made of light, pulsing with meanings just beyond my comprehension. I began to lose time during the day, small gaps where I would find myself standing somewhere with no memory of how I'd gotten there, outside the thrift store, staring at the empty window display. On the docks at sunrise, salt water soaking through my shoes. In the cannery break room, holding conversations with co-workers who insisted I'd been standing silent for the past 10 minutes. The plant nurse suggested I might be suffering from exhaustion, possibly mild carbon monoxide poisoning from the old heaters in the company housing. She recommended I spend more time outdoors, get some fresh air, maybe see about transferring to a room with better ventilation. But the air outside didn't feel fresh anymore. It carried scents that made my skin crawl, rotting kelp and something else, something organic and wrong that reminded me of fish left too long in the sun. And everywhere I went, I had the growing sensation of being watched. It wasn't paranoia. I knew what paranoia felt like. The constant background anxiety that everyone was talking about you, judging you, planning something behind your back. This was different. This was the specific focused attention of something that studied you the way a biologist might study a specimen. Patient, clinical, utterly without empathy. The pale thing in the dumpster area became a regular sight, though I was never sure if I was seeing the same creature or multiple individuals. They moved differently each time, sometimes with seal-like undulation, other times upright like malformed children learning to walk. Their skin had a translucent quality that made me think of deep-sea creatures brought too quickly to the surface. I started carrying a camera, determined to get proof of what I was seeing, but every photo came out blurred or empty, showing nothing but fog and shadows, where I was certain solid forms had been standing moments before. The singing grew more frequent and insistent. Some nights it seemed to come from directly beneath my floor, as if something was calling from the crawl space between the building's foundation and the permafrost below. Other times it drifted in from the harbor, harmonies that rose and fell with the tide. I began to recognize patterns in the melody, recurring themes that suggested structure and meaning. It reminded me of the call and response patterns in whaling songs, but twisted into something that made my teeth ache and my vision blur around the edges. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when I woke to find the tusk standing upright in the center of my small table, balanced impossibly on its pointed tip. Around its base, someone had scattered fresh kelp and what looked like small bones. Nothing I could identify, but definitely organic, and definitely not from any fish I'd ever processed. My hands shook as I swept the offerings into the trash, but the tusk remained perfectly balanced, defying physics with the casual indifference of a magic trick. When I tried to push it over, it resisted with the solidity of something rooted deep in the earth. That evening, I made my decision. If the thing wanted fire, I'd give it fire. The dock stayed busy until well after sunset, but eventually the last of the fishing boats tied up, and their crews headed home to warm meals and warmer beds. I waited until the industrial lights dimmed to their minimal overnight setting, then made my way down to the water with the tusk wrapped in a spare work shirt. The fog was rolling in again, thick and deliberate as a living thing. By the time I reached the end of the longest pier, visibility had dropped to maybe 20 feet in any direction. Perfect for what I had in mind. I'd expected to have trouble getting a fire started with the damp wood scattered around the dock, but the old pallets and broken crates caught flame with surprising eagerness. Soon I had a respectable blaze going in the metal drum someone had left for that purpose. The tusk felt heavier than usual as I unwrapped it, and for a moment I hesitated. It was a beautiful piece of work, possibly valuable to the right collector. But beauty meant nothing when it came attached to whatever was happening to me. I threw it into the flames with more force than necessary. The carved ivory didn't burn the way I expected. Instead of blackening and cracking, it seemed to absorb the fire, glowing from within like a coal. The intricate patterns along its surface became more distinct, more complex, as if the heat was revealing details that had been hidden before. And the singing started immediately, not from the docks this time, but from the water itself. Voices rising from the dark depths between the pier pilings, harmonizing with the crackle and pop of burning wood. I could see shapes moving beneath the surface, pale forms that swirled and danced in patterns that hurt to follow. The tusk pulsed brighter with each note, and I realized with growing horror that destroying it wasn't ending anything. It was completing something. I tried to fish the ivory out of the flames with a piece of driftwood, but it had settled too deep into the burning mass. The heat drove me back, and I could only watch as the ancient carvings seemed to writhe and reform themselves in the orange glow. The voices from the water grew louder, more insistent. I could almost understand words now, syllables that scraped against the inside of my skull like fingernails on slate. They were calling something, summoning something, and the burning tusk was their beacon. That's when I felt the deck shift beneath my feet. The pier was solid construction, designed to handle the weight of fully loaded boats and the stress of ocean storms. But something was moving underneath it now, something large enough to make the heavy timbers creak and sway. I backed toward shore, but the fog had thickened until I couldn't see the shoreline anymore. The orange glow of the fire seemed to be the only fixed point in a world that had suddenly become fluid and uncertain. The singing surrounded me now, coming from above and below and every direction at once. The dock lurched again, more violently this time. One of the support posts visible above the waterline showed fresh scratches in the treated wood, deep gouges that looked like claw marks, but far too large to have been made by any sea creature I knew. Through the flames, the tusk continued to pulse with its internal light. And as I watched, frozen between fascination and terror, I saw the fire begin to move. Not the random flicker of burning wood, but deliberate motion that followed the rhythm of the underwater chorus. The singing reached a crescendo, and the ice around the pier began to crack. Not the normal groaning and settling of winter ice, but sharp reports like gunshots. Fissures spread outward from the pier in geometric patterns that reminded me uncomfortably of the carvings on the tusk. And from those cracks came a phosphorescent glow, as if something luminous was rising from the depths. The deck beneath my feet tilted sharply to one side. I ran then, stumbling through fog thick as cotton toward what I hoped was the shore. Behind me, the voices rose to an almost painful volume, and I could hear the sound of wood splintering as something immense shifted in the water below. I didn't stop running until I reached the company store, and I didn't look back until I was safely inside my room with the door locked and a chair braced against it. From my window I could see the fire still burning on the dock, a tiny orange point in the gray void. The singing had stopped, but I could feel something vast and patient settling back into the depths, satisfied for now. The next morning, the pier showed no damage. The fire drum was empty and cold, as if it had been cleaned out hours before. When I asked the dockmaster about any disturbances during the night, he assured me everything had been quiet as a grave. But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard, what I'd felt moving beneath the ice, and I knew it wasn't over. The tusk was gone, consumed by flames that had burned far hotter than they should have. But its destruction hadn't ended the connection I'd somehow forged with whatever lived in the deep water beyond the harbor. If anything, it had strengthened it. I gave my notice the next day, claiming a family emergency back home. The plant supervisor barely looked up from his paperwork when he signed the release forms. Seasonal workers came and went like the tide. My departure was just another minor notation in an endless cycle of arrivals and departures. As I packed my few belongings, I found myself listening for the voices I knew would return with the next fog bank. They were part of me now, woven into my dreams and swimming just below the surface of my waking thoughts. The bus south wouldn't arrive until the following Tuesday. 5 more days in this place where the line between reality and nightmare had worn thin as old rope. 5 more nights of voices calling from the depths and shapes moving through the gray void between sea and sky. I tell myself it was all stress and isolation, the cumulative effect of months in a place where the sun barely rose and human contact was measured in shift changes and shared cigarettes. The mind could create elaborate fictions when starved of proper stimulation. Sleep deprivation could manufacture entire universes of imagined threat and supernatural intervention. But when the fog rolls in thick and the temperature drops just enough to make the water between the pier pilings creak and whisper, I find myself listening for familiar harmonies. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is right, I swear I can still hear them calling me home. Story 14. The realtor never mentioned the weight of the place. I signed the lease papers for the Blackwood farmhouse on a crisp September morning, drawn by the promise of authentic 19th century architecture and the kind of solitude that only Vermont's northeast hills could provide. The property had been on the market for months, a restoration project that most contractors avoided due to its remote location, and the previous owner's tendency to modify the original structure in ways that defied both logic and building codes. What I didn't expect was how the house would settle around me like an old coat, familiar in ways that made my skin crawl. The first week passed in a blur of inventory and planning. The elderly caretaker had left behind an impressive collection of period-appropriate tools, hand planes with worn wooden handles, chisels sharp enough to draw blood, and a collection of hammers that felt perfectly balanced in my grip. I found them arranged in the workshop adjacent to the main barn, each tool hanging in precise order, as if waiting for someone who knew exactly where they belonged. I knew exactly where they belonged. The realization struck me as I hung a dovetail saw on what felt like its proper hook. My hand moved without conscious thought, muscle memory guiding me to a spot I'd never seen before. The weight of the tool, the grain of the wooden handle, the slight curve where decades of use had worn the metal smooth. Everything felt like coming home. But it was the reflection in the workshop window that first made me question my own perception. I was adjusting a hand plane when movement caught my peripheral vision. Someone in a dark jacket and wool cap was crossing the space between the barn and the side of the house. The figure moved with purpose, shoulders hunched against a wind I couldn't feel, heading toward what appeared to be a side entrance I'd never noticed. When I turned to look directly, the yard was empty. I stepped outside, scanning the property with the methodical attention to detail that 10 years in architectural restoration had trained into me. The side of the house showed no evidence of a door, just weathered clapboard siding and a foundation stone that bore no marks of modification. Yet as I stood there, I could swear I heard the distant sound of a door closing, the particular creak of old hinges that needed oil. That evening, I spread the original architectural plans across the kitchen table. The 1847 blueprints showed the house exactly as I'd found it, with one notable exception. A side entrance marked clearly on the eastern wall, labeled in faded ink as service door, kitchen access. According to the renovation notes penciled in the margins, that door had been sealed and sided over in 1978. I walked the perimeter of the house 3 times before convinced myself I was overthinking things. Old houses played tricks on the mind, shadows that suggested movement, sounds that echoed from empty rooms, the constant settling of timber that could mimic footsteps. I'd experienced it all before in other restoration projects, but I'd never before found photographs of myself in a house I'd never lived in. The discovery came during my exploration of the attic space above the workshop. I was measuring for new insulation when my flashlight beam caught the glint of something metallic wedged between the floor joists. Reaching into the narrow space, my fingers closed around a small metal box, the kind used to store important documents. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were 7 Polaroid photographs. The images were faded but clear enough to stop my breath. Each showed a man working on various restoration projects around the property. The figure wore clothes I recognized, the same dark wool jacket hanging in my bedroom closet, the same cap I'd purchased just weeks before the move. But it was the face that made my hands shake as I held the photos up to the light. It was my face. Not similar, not reminiscent. My exact features, down to a small scar above my left eyebrow from a childhood accident. The man in the photographs wielded the same tools I'd been using, stood in the same workshop where I now spent my days, even appeared to be working on the same sections of the house I had planned to tackle. In one image, he was installing what looked like new window trim on the eastern wall, exactly where the sealed door should have been. I studied each photograph until my eyes burned, searching for any detail that might explain the impossible similarity. The clothes were identical to items in my wardrobe. The posture, the way the figure held the tools, even the slight forward lean I adopted when concentrating on detailed work. Everything matched my own habits with uncanny precision. But it was the date stamped in the corner of each Polaroid that made my throat constrict. October 1977. I was born in 1985. That night, I barely slept. The photographs lay spread across the kitchen table like tarot cards predicting a future I couldn't comprehend. Every sound the old house made, and it made many, seemed to carry significance. The whisper of wind through gaps in the siding became whispered conversations. The settling of timber became footsteps in rooms I knew were empty. Around midnight, I was startled awake by light filtering through my bedroom window. The workshop below was illuminated, a warm yellow glow that shouldn't have been possible since I'd installed no electrical lighting in that building. I crept to the window and peered down at the workshop. Through the gaps in the weathered boards, I could see the steady flame of what appeared to be a kerosene lantern. Shadows moved across the walls, the precise, methodical movements of someone working. My blood ran cold when I realized I could hear the rhythmic sound of a hand plane sliding across wood. I dressed quickly and made my way downstairs, grabbing a flashlight and stepping out into the October night. The air was sharp with the promise of frost, and my breath formed small clouds as I approached the workshop. The building appeared dark from the outside, no trace of the light I'd seen from my bedroom window. But the door stood slightly ajar, and I was certain I'd locked it before retiring. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. My flashlight beam revealed the workshop exactly as I'd left it, tools hanging in their designated places, workbench cleared of debris. But the air held the lingering scent of kerosene and something else, sawdust from freshly planed wood. On the workbench, I found a piece of pine that hadn't been there hours earlier. Someone had been planing it smooth, the curled shavings still holding their shape beside the board. The wood was warm to the touch. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the kitchen, watching the workshop through the window and trying to rationalize what I'd experienced. Squatters, perhaps, though the isolation of the property made that unlikely. A caretaker with access, checking on the property, though no one had mentioned such an arrangement. But as dawn approached and my exhaustion deepened, a more disturbing possibility began to take shape in my mind. What if the man in the photographs wasn't someone who looked like me? What if it was me? The thought should have been absurd, dismissed immediately by any rational mind. But as I sat there in the growing light, surrounded by tools that felt familiar in my hands and working on a house that seemed to welcome my presence with an eagerness that bordered on hunger, rationality felt like a luxury I could no longer afford. The next few days passed in a haze of doubt and careful observation. I began documenting everything, taking photographs of the workshop before and after each session, making detailed notes about the placement of tools, measuring and remeasuring every aspect of my work to ensure I wasn't unconsciously creating the very evidence that troubled me. But the signs continued to accumulate. I would leave a tool in one location and find it in another, always precisely where it would be most useful for the next phase of my work. Measurements. I was certain I'd taken proved to be recorded in my notebook in handwriting that looked like mine but felt unfamiliar. Plans I didn't remember making appeared sketched in the margins of my architectural drawings, showing solutions to problems I hadn't yet encountered. Most disturbing were the moments when I would catch myself working with a competence that surprised me. My hands would move to complete complex joints I'd never attempted before, executing techniques with a precision that suggested years of practice. I would find myself humming songs I didn't recognize while working, melodies that seemed to emerge from some deep well of memory I couldn't access directly. It was during one of these moments, as I worked on replacing the rotted sill beneath the eastern windows, that I heard the sound that changed everything. The sharp, familiar chime of my cell phone's ringtone echoed through the house. I set down my tools and checked my pocket. The phone was there, silent and showing no missed calls. But the ringing continued, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. I followed the sound through the main rooms, down a hallway that seemed longer than I remembered, until it led me to a door I was certain hadn't been there before. The door was solid oak, painted white, with brass hardware that showed the patina of decades of use. It stood slightly open, and the ringing came from beyond it. But according to every architectural plan I'd studied, this door opened onto the exterior wall, the exact location where the service entrance had been sealed in 1978. I pushed the door open. Beyond it lay not the outside world, but a room I'd never seen. It was a study or office, paneled in dark wood and furnished with pieces that suggested the late 19th century. Kerosene lamps provided warm, steady light, and the walls were lined with shelves containing books whose leather bindings showed the wear of frequent use. At a heavy wooden desk in the center of the room sat a man. He looked up as I entered, and I found myself staring into my own eyes. The figure was dressed in the same clothes I wore, work shirt and canvas pants, the wool jacket I'd left hanging in the workshop. But his hands showed calluses in different places, and his face carried lines that spoke of different concerns. When he smiled, I recognized my own expression, but felt none of the warmth that should have accompanied it. He gestured to a chair across from the desk, and I found myself sitting without conscious decision. The room felt real, more real than the house I'd been living in, more solid than the world I thought I knew. The scent of lamp oil and aged paper filled my nostrils, and I could hear the distant sound of wind through trees that I somehow knew were different from the ones surrounding the property. The other version of myself opened a leather-bound ledger and began to write. I couldn't see the words, but I watched my own hand form letters with an elegant script I'd never learned. After several minutes, he closed the book and looked at me with an expression I couldn't interpret. Then he spoke, and I heard my own voice saying words I hadn't planned to speak. "You've been doing good work on the house, but there's still so much that needs attention." The conversation that followed felt like speaking to a reflection that had developed independent thoughts. He told me about projects I hadn't yet planned, showed me techniques I'd never learned, discussed the history of the property with knowledge I didn't possess. Yet every word felt familiar, as if I were remembering conversations I'd had with myself in dreams. He explained that the house had always had its keeper, someone who understood its needs and could maintain the delicate balance between past and present. The role passed from one guardian to the next, but never in the way people might expect. Sometimes the house chose its keeper from among the living. Sometimes it had to be more creative. As he spoke, I began to understand that the photographs in the attic weren't evidence of an impossible coincidence. They were documentation of work I had done, in a time I had lived, in a version of reality that existed parallel to the one I thought I knew. The realization should have terrified me. Instead, it brought a strange sense of completion, as if I'd finally found a missing piece of myself. I don't know how long I spent in that room. Time seemed to move differently there, flowing around us like water around stones. We discussed the remaining restoration work, and I found myself taking notes in the elegant script I'd never learned, planning projects with skills I'd never acquired. When I finally stood to leave, the other version of myself handed me a key I didn't recognize. "For when you're ready to stay," he said. I walked back through the door and found myself in the familiar hallway of the farmhouse. But when I turned to look back, I saw only the wall where the door had been, painted white and showing no sign of ever having been disturbed. The key remained solid and warm in my hand. Over the following days, I continued my work on the house, but with a growing sense that I was participating in a cycle that extended far beyond my conscious understanding. The tools responded to my hands with increasing familiarity. The house itself seemed to anticipate my needs, revealing hidden damage that needed attention just as I acquired the skills to address it. The boundary between my intentional actions and automatic responses began to blur. I would find myself working on projects I didn't remember starting, using techniques I was certain I'd never learned. My notebook filled with plans and measurements in handwriting that grew more elegant with each page. The neighbors, when I encountered them during trips to town for supplies, would nod with the familiarity of people who had known me for years. The hardware store owner mentioned previous orders I didn't remember placing. The postal clerk handed me mail addressed to names I didn't recognize, though the address was clearly mine. It was the postal clerk who mentioned the doorbell. "Fixed the old system, did you?" she asked as she handed me a package. "Haven't heard it ring like that in decades. Has that same sound as the old rotary phones used to make." I thanked her and left without explaining that I'd never touched the doorbell, that it had been ringing with the tone from my cell phone for weeks, that the house had no landline service. That evening, as I worked in the shop by the light of kerosene lamps I didn't remember lighting, I heard my phone ring again. This time, I didn't follow the sound. Instead, I continued planning the board in front of me, listening as my own footsteps echoed from inside the house, as my own voice answered a phone that couldn't possibly be there. I understood now that the house was teaching me, preparing me for a role I'd somehow always been destined to fill. Each day, the work became more intuitive. Each night, the boundary between who I had been and who I was becoming grew thinner. The key the other version of myself had given me remained in my pocket, growing warmer each day. I know now that soon I'll use it. The house needs its keeper, and I'm beginning to understand that I've always been here, in one form or another. The man in the photographs, the figure crossing the yard, the voice answering phantom phone calls. They're all me, existing in the spaces between what was and what is, maintaining the continuity that allows the past to speak to the present. The neighbors call it the guardian, but they don't understand the full truth. I'm not guarding the house from anything. The house is keeping me,